Money Can't Buy the Dead by Anthony Darder, Chapter 1. Running a legitimate business was a special kind of hell I hadn't anticipated. Give me a dark alley, a rain-slicked trench coat, and a crooked palooka with a blackjack, and I knew exactly how to handle myself. But give me a stack of pristine, state-mandated tax forms, a rotary telephone that wouldn't stop ringing, and a brand new mahogany desk I was legally obligated not to burn for firewood, and I was ready to pull my own teeth out with a pair of pliers. I sat back in my leather chair, letting the springs groan under my weight, and stared through the amber liquid in my glass. It was barely noon, but the sun beating through the frosted glass of our front door was giving me a headache that started right behind my eyeballs. Joe Russo had abandoned me 3 hours ago, claiming he had to verify some transit logs down at the rail yards. I knew his shorthand. It was code for, "I'm letting you handle the paperwork so I don't lose my mind." Worse, he'd left me with a mandate before adjusting his fedora and slipping out into the heat. "We're killing Rose," Joe had told me. "She's running herself ragged trying to keep our books straight while managing the breakfast rush at the diner. Hire a secretary, Jack, today, and try not to frighten them." I sneered at the glass in my hand. I hadn't frightened them. They were just duds. I'd spent the morning interviewing a parade of the most fragile, rigid, and impossibly clean girls Los Angeles had to offer. The first one had nearly fainted when Polly walked in, completely unannounced, to sleep off a hangover on our office couch. The second had started correcting my fucking grammar before looking at a grease stain on the carpet with the kind of horror usually reserved for a fresh homicide. None of them would last a day in a room with the boys. This wasn't an office, it was a bunker with a typewriter. Then came a sharp, rhythmic knock that rattled the glass. It wasn't the timid tap of the previous girls, nor was it the heavy structural thud dog face makes when he forgets his own size. It was precise, measured, even. "Come in," I grunted, not bothering to take my feet off the corner of the desk. The door swung open and Betty James walked into my life. She wasn't wearing white gloves or a lace collar like the others. She wore a sharp, tailored gray suit that looked like it meant business, her dark hair pinned back in a neat, no-nonsense roll. But it was the way she moved that caught my attention. Her heels struck the hardwood with a crisp, cadence-driven snap I recognized instantly. She carried herself with her chin up and her shoulders locked back, a posture that hadn't been beaten into her by some fancy Beverly Hills finishing school. She didn't look at the dent in the wall where Handsome had thrown a stray shoe last Tuesday. She didn't flinch at the faint smell of stale cigar smoke. She walked straight to the chair opposite me, stood behind it, and waited. "Mr. Morgan?" Her voice was clear, cutting through the midday heat like a cold blade. "That's me," I said, squinting up at her. "You're Betty James?" "I am. Sit." She sat, her back perfectly straight, not even letting her spine touch the cushions. She placed a neat leather folder on the edge of my desk. I didn't open it. I just leaned forward, resting my elbows on the wood, looking her over. "You're late, Miss James. The ad said 11. The streetcar had a flat tire on Wilshire, Mr. Morgan. If you'd prefer a secretary who can control the municipal transit schedule, I suggest you hire a magician." My left eyebrow twitched. I hid a grin behind my glass. All right, she's got teeth. "The work around here isn't standard corporate typing, Miss James," I told her, leaning back. "We handle messy people with messy problems. Sometimes those problems will walk right through that door with a bloody nose or a chip on their shoulder. Most girls who came in here today looked like they'd scream if a mouse coughed." Betty looked right at me, her eyes steady, completely unblinking. "I spent 3 years in the Women's Army Corps, Mr. Morgan. I was a sergeant. I've managed motor pools in the mud, organized logistics for 3,000 men who hadn't seen a shower in a month, and had a mortar shell take out my supply tent in 44. If a man walks in here with a bloody nose, I'll tell him to stop bleeding on the upholstery and state his business." I froze. I stared at her for 3 long seconds. The lazy, mocking slouch vanished from my spine, replaced by the instinctual respect of a man who had frozen in the trenches of Bastogne. "Whack?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave. "A sergeant?" "Yes, sir." I looked at the folder on my desk, then back at her. A slow, genuine smile crept onto my face. The first real one I'd had all day. "Well, damn," I muttered. "Looks like the boys are finally going to have some supervision." I reached across the desk, offering her a calloused hand. "Welcome aboard, Sarge. Your first job is finding out where the hell Russo hid the good bourbon." I smiled, leaning back as she took in the battlefield that was our reception lobby. "Sarge?" she asked, her eyebrows pulling together just a fraction. "Yep," I replied, letting a sly, mischievous smile creep onto my face. "Well, what do you prefer I call you?" "Call me asshole for all I care," I joked, tapping the ash from my cigarette into the glass. She didn't miss a beat. "I'm sure I will at some point, but that must be earned, so, Mr. Morgan." "Jack." "Okay, Jack, show me to my desk." I gestured lazily toward the frosted door. "You passed it as you walked in." She looked back over her shoulder. "That thing's scattered with paperwork, empty beer bottles, and overflowing ashtrays?" "That's the one." She turned her head, looking out at the heavy oak desk sitting in the center of the lobby. "Looks like I have my work cut out for me." "Just wait until you meet the boys," I replied, my smile widening. "I can't wait," she said, her voice dry enough to cure ham. She turned on her heel and marched out to confront the disaster zone. Through the glass, I watched her start to salvage the desk. She picked up half-burnt cigars, dead cigarettes, empty beer bottles, and greasy sandwich wrappers left behind by Paulie and Handsome. For a second, she paused, holding a particularly crusty coffee cup, and I could tell she was actively wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake signing up for this outfit. Before she could walk out, the front door clicked open, and Joe Russo walked in, the midday heat rolling in behind him. He stopped, taking in the sight of a sharp, attractive woman currently hauling our trash. "You must be the new secretary," Joe said, tipping his fedora with that smooth, polite cadence he used when he wasn't breaking fingers. "Hi, I'm Joe." "Betty," she replied, giving him a quick, efficient nod. "Nice to meet you, Betty. Welcome to the Morgan and Russo Detective Agency." Joe glanced toward my door, his face tightening just a bit. "I need to have a word with Jack." Joe walked into my office and shut the door behind him, clicking the latch into place. I didn't even look up from the glass in my hand. "I'm sure you saw. I hope you're happy. I hired one." "I see," Joe said, leaning his hip against the edge of my desk. "Pretty girl. Do you think she can handle the job?" "The paperwork?" I replied, finally looking up at him. "I think she'll do just fine." "That's not what I mean, Jack," Joe said, his voice dropping into that serious, practical tone. He knew the kind of lowlifes, hoods, and local muscle that bled all over our waiting room. I let out a low chuckle and gave him a devilish grin. "She was a WAC Sergeant, Joe. Ran motor pools in the mud and took mortar fire in 44. Trust me, she can hold her own." Joe stared at me for a second, letting that sink in, and I could see the immediate relief and a sudden, quiet spark of genuine appreciation cross his face. I watched through the glass for another second as Joe digested the news about Betty's military background. But before he could say anything else, the front door rattled open again. It was Paulie. He shuffled into the lobby looking like a half-collapsed umbrella, his tie undone, a fresh cigar clamped between his teeth, and a folded copy of the Los Angeles Times shoved under his arm. He didn't even notice Betty standing there. He just made a straight line for his favorite leather couch, tossed his paper onto the floor, and groaned as he dropped his weight onto the cushions. Betty froze, a half-empty beer bottle in one hand and a crumpled sandwich wrapper in the other. She looked down at Paulie like he was a stain she couldn't scrub out. Paulie just closed his eyes, pulled his hat down over his face, and let out a long, raspy sigh. She was completely unimpressed. I smirked, pushing my office door open and leaning against the frame. Joe followed me out, watching the show with an amused grin. "Don't mind him, Sarge," I said, nodding toward the couch. "That's Polly. We're all three army buddies, served together." Betty looked from Polly's snoring form to Joe's neat suit, and finally back to me, looking like me, her arms crossed over her chest. "I'm sure it was a well-disciplined unit," she sarcastically joked. "Not exactly," I replied with a chuckle. "But we got shit done. Clearly," she muttered, her eyes dropping back to the overflowing ashtray on her desk. Leaving Betty to her battlefield, I grabbed my fedora off the coat rack. The midday heat was baking the asphalt outside, and my stomach was starting to growl loud enough to drown out the LA traffic. I told Joe I'd be back in an hour and headed down the block toward the diner. The lunch rush was just starting to wind down when I slipped through the door. The air inside was thick with the heavy, comforting smell of grease, burnt coffee, and fried onions. The jukebox in the corner was low, humming some melancholy tune I didn't care to name. I spotted Rose near the back booths, her arms loaded with dirty plates, her red hair pinned up, but a few stray pieces hanging damp against her neck. She looked exhausted, but she was still moving with that fierce, high-energy rhythm that kept the whole place alive. She didn't see me come in. I slid into a corner booth, grabbed a laminated menu from the metal rack, and held it up right in front of my face, completely hiding behind it. A moment later, the rubber soles of her shoes squeaked against the linoleum as she stopped at my table. I heard the familiar click of her pen. "What'll it be today?" she asked, her voice carrying that tired, automatic friendliness of a seasoned waitress. I kept the menu tight against my nose and lowered my voice, trying to sound like a slick Hollywood casting director. "You look pretty good." Without a single second of hesitation, Rose shot right back. "I'm not on the menu, and I'm spoken for. But if the price is right..." I lowered the menu just an inch, squinting at her over the top of the laminate. "Do you speak to all your customers this way?" "That depends on how well they tip," she replied, a sudden knowing smirk cracking through her tired expression. She snatched the menu right out of my hands and slid her pencil behind her ear. "Would you like a hamburger?" I let out a dry laugh. I couldn't fool her if I tried. "Hamburger with fries. And keep the coffee coming." Rose scribbled it down on her pad, but she didn't leave the booth right away. She leaned one hand on the edge of the table, her eyes searching mine. "How is the search going? Joe told me he was going to make you sit in that chair until you found someone." "I found someone," I said, leaning back against the vinyl. "Matter of fact, I just hired her before I walked out the door." Rose raised an eyebrow. "Really? What's she like?" "Her name's Betty, but I'm calling her Sarge. She was a WAC Sergeant, ran motor pools." Rose let out a soft whistle, a genuine look of relief crossing her face before she smiled. "I hope she can handle it. It takes a special kind of woman to handle my boys." I blinked, looking up at her. "Your boys?" Rose gave me a soft, fiercely protective look, the kind that made the heavy weight in my chest feel just a little bit lighter. She reached out, giving my shoulder a quick, affectionate squeeze. "Yes," she said softly, "but if it makes you feel better, you are my favorite." Chapter 2. By the time I walked back from the diner, the hamburger was a heavy lump in my stomach, and the afternoon sun was melting the LA asphalt right through the soles of my shoes. I pushed into the office lobby and stopped. Sarge had already made a dent. The crumpled wrappers were gone, the empty beer bottles were boxed up by the door, and the air smelled less like Paulie's stale cigars and more like industrial pine sol. Paulie was still asleep on the couch, but she'd ruthlessly stacked 3 months of unfiled transit logs right next to his head like a paper pillow. "You missed a spot," I muttered, nodding toward Paulie. Sarge didn't look up from her typewriter, her fingers flying across the keys with the rhythm of a machine gun. "He's next on my list, Jack. I'm just waiting for the trash collector to pull up outside." I let out a dry chuckle and headed into my office, leaving the door cracked. Joe was already inside, leaning against the window frame and staring out at the heat waves rising off the street. For about 20 minutes, The only sound was the steady clack, clack, clack of Sarge mastering the front desk. Then, the typewriter stopped. The heavy structural thud of the front door opening didn't sound like a client. It sounded like a military occupation. A second later, 3 men stepped into our waiting room. I didn't have to look through the glass to know who it was. I knew the specific heavy leather scrape of Dogface's boots, and I knew the quiet, silk-lined rustle of Don Pandolini's tailored overcoat. My stomach did a cold flip. Pandolini didn't visit people. He was the sun. You rotated around him. If you wanted a word, you sat in the back of his dark restaurant and waited until he beckoned with a manicured finger. If the old man was standing in our rented, pine-scented lobby at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, the world outside me was actively on fire. Joe turned away from the window, his face going completely rigid. Our eyes met, and the lazy post-lunch haze vanished from the room. Out in the lobby, Sarge didn't care about underworld physics. She just saw 3 men standing in her clean workspace. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Her voice cut through the silence, cool and completely unimpressed. "We're here for Jack," Dogface rumbled, his massive bulk casting a shadow across her desk. "Mr. Morgan is in a meeting," Sarge replied, her voice taking on that sharp, administrative edge that usually came with a clipboard. "Names, please. I'll see if he can fit you in." A beat of heavy silence followed. The mob guys weren't used to being asked for a name, let alone a time slot. "I'm handsome," the young one smooth-talked, leaning a hand on her desk with a slick Hollywood grin. "And this big palooka is Dogface." Through the cracked door, I watched Sarge slowly stop what she was doing. She looked at Handsome's pressed suit, then up at Dogface's scarred, heavy jawline. She didn't flinch. She just let out a short, dismissive scoff. "Those aren't real names," she said flatly. Handsome blinked, his smile faltering. "Excuse me? You heard me," Sarge said, pulling a fresh ledger sheet toward her. "You look like a George, and the big one looks like a William. Now, if you want to see Mr. Morgan, I need proper identification for the log." Dogface shifted his weight, looking entirely out of his depth. "Hey, how'd she know my name was William?" Pandolini let out a soft, amused grunt from behind them, raising a hand to quiet his boys. He stepped forward, tipping his hat slightly toward Sarge. "Just tell him the Don is here, Signorina." Sarge stood up, smoothing the front of her gray suit jacket. "Very well, Mr. Don. Wait here." I scrambled back behind my desk, dropping into my chair and grabbing a stray pencil, trying like hell to look like I was buried in important corporate thoughts. Joe caught on instantly, crossing his arms and leaning against the filing cabinet with a perfectly straight face. The door opened, and Sarge stepped in, shutting it firmly behind her to keep the ruffians out. "Jack," she said, her voice dropping to a professional murmur, "there's a gentleman named Don here to see you. He has 2 very strange, poorly named bodyguards with him." I kept my eyes on the paper, biting the inside of my cheek until it nearly bled. A gentleman named Don. "Is that so, Sarge?" I asked, looking up with the straightest face I could muster. "Yes, he seems polite enough, but his associates look like they belong in a police lineup, not a respectable establishment." "Show him in," I said, letting a tiny, devilish smirk slip through. "And Sarge, maybe don't call the big one William to his face again. He gets sensitive." She gave me a skeptical look, clearly realizing I was pulling her leg, but she just nodded and opened the door. "Right this way, Mr. Don." Pandolini stepped into the office, his eyes crinkling with a quiet, lethal amusement as he glanced back at Sarge. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, the amusement vanished. The old man looked tired. The deep lines around his eyes looked like trenches, and his mouth was set in a hard, grim line. He didn't waste time with small talk. He didn't even sit down. "We have a problem, Jack," Pandolini said, his voice dropping into that raspy, low-frequency whisper that usually meant someone was about to get buried in the canyons. "A very big Very loud problem. I leaned forward, tossing the pencil onto the desk. You're a long way from home, Don. Who died? Nobody yet, Pandolini said, looking straight at me. But if we don't move fast, a little girl is going to end up in a ditch, and a lot of money isn't going to mean a damn thing. Pandolini glanced back toward the closed door, then turned his gaze squarely onto me. Have Joe join us, he said, his voice flat. Everyone is needed for this one. Joe didn't need an invitation. He stepped away from the filing cabinet and pulled up a chair, his face hard as flint. I gestured toward the empty leather seat opposite my desk. But Pandolini remained standing, his gloved hands resting on the silver head of his walking stick. A man called me this morning, Pandolini began, the words coming out slow and heavy. A powerful man. Industrial fortune, shipping lanes, mansions in the hills. Years ago, before he was a kingmaker, he did a favor for my family. A debt is a debt, Jack. And today, he called it in. The old man paused, his jaw tightening until the bones showed white through his skin. His daughter, 10 years old. Some bastard snatched her right out of her bedroom last night. The kidnappers gave him a week to pull together $500,000 in unmarked cash. If the clock runs out, they kill the girl. I let out a low whistle. $500,000. That wasn't a petty shakedown. That was a corporate execution. So the high-hatter wants you to grease the wheels for the ransom drop? I asked. Pandolini's eyes flashed with a cold, terrifying fire. I do not pay vermin, Jack. And anyone who would lay a finger on a child is vermin. What do you do with vermin, Jack? You exterminate them. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. When the Don talked about extermination, he wasn't talking about a quick bullet in an alley. He was talking about pulling an operation out by its roots. I leaned back in my chair, tapping a cigarette out of my pack, but not lighting it yet. I wanted to sound tough, but a man has to look at his ledger. I don't mean to sound cold, Don, I said, squinting up at him through the dim light. But the bills around here are piling up. The landlord doesn't care about honor, and my new secretary doesn't work for free. How much is this tycoon actually willing to pay to get his hands dirty? A faint ghostly shadow of a smile touched Pandolini's mouth. That is exactly why I thought of you, Jack, he said softly. The father doesn't just want his daughter back, he wants blood. He told me he is willing to pay double the ransom amount just to make the bastards pay. My hand froze halfway to my mouth. I stared at him, double. $1 million, I muttered, the number tasting heavy on my tongue. I looked over at Joe, whose eyes had gone wide enough to show the whites. I turned back to the old man, a slow, dangerous grin spreading across my face. For $1 million, we'll make them suffer. Hell, Don. For that kind of money, we'd do it for free. Of course, Pandolini countered smoothly, adjusting the lapels of his pristine overcoat. I will need my cut, say 25%. Consider it a finder's fee for bringing such an expensive problem to your doorstep. Before the math could even clear my head, Joe leaned forward, his fist smacking down onto the mahogany desk. It's a deal, Joe chimed in, his voice sharp and decisive. I looked at my partner, then back at the Don. $250,000 to Pandolini still left us with a three-way split of $750,000. That was enough money to buy every high society mansion in Bel-Air and still have enough left over to bury the kidnappers in gold-plated coffins. All right, I said, finally striking a match against the side of my desk and lighting the cigarette. We're in. Where do we find this grieving millionaire? Chapter 3. Before we packed into the car and drove into the hills, I went back to the diner. I didn't want Rose worrying when she saw our office dark and the DeSoto gone for days at a time. The lunch rush was entirely dead now. Rose was wiping down the laminate counter with a rag. Her shoulders dropped in that rare moment of quiet peace. When the bell above the door chimed, she looked up, her expression softening when she saw it was me. "But back so soon?" she asked, tossing the rag into a bucket. "Did the hamburger not agree with you?" "The burger was fine," I said, sliding onto a bar stool. I didn't beat around the bush. "We got a case, Rose, a big one. Don Pandolini came to the office himself. The towel in her hand stopped moving. Her eyes went sharp. Pandolini? What's happened, Jack? A kidnapping, I said, keeping my voice low so the short-order cook couldn't hear. Some bastard snatched a 10-year-old girl out of her bed last night. We're on a rescue mission to get her back. I left out the part about Pandolini calling them vermin. I left out the part about extermination. Rose knew what kind of men we were, and she knew what we did to people who crossed the line. But she didn't need the bloody details weighing on her heart while she was pouring coffee. Little girl, Rose whispered, her hand tightening around the rag. A fierce, protective anger flashed across her face. You bring her home, Jack. You hear me? You bring her back to her mother. We will, I said. Then I let out a dry, cynical chuckle. The father is some high-hat tycoon in the hills. He's throwing money at the problem. If we bring her back, we stand to clear $750,000, our share. Rose didn't blink. She didn't gasp. To a woman who worked 14-hour days for nickels and dimes, a number that big didn't even sound real. It was just a word. None of our people were impressed by money. We'd seen too many men with fat wallets act like cowards when the shooting started. Money comes in handy, I suppose, Rose said flatly, reaching out to touch my hand. Her eyes were deadly serious. But the money doesn't matter, Jack. Just don't let those wealthy bastards change who you are. And don't you dare come back to me in a pine box. I'm too stubborn to die, Rose, I said, squeezing her hand back. Keep the coffee warm for me. An hour later, we were packed into the 4-door DeSoto like a mobile infantry unit. I was behind the wheel, Joe was riding shotgun with the maps, and the back seat was a wall-to-wall nightmare of wool suits and broken noses. We'd actually managed to drag Paulie off the office couch, though he was currently snoring against the window, smelling like stale beer. Handsome was busy checking his hair in the rearview mirror, and Dogface was crammed in the middle, his massive knees practically shoved into his chin. We drove up into the Bel-Air hills, where the roads got winding and the air started smelling like orange blossoms instead of exhaust fumes. We finally pulled up to a set of massive wrought iron gates that opened automatically, leading down a circular gravel driveway. At the end of the driveway sat a house that looked like a Greek temple that had lost its mind. It was all white marble, giant columns, and pristine, manicured lawns without a single blade of grass out of place. I slammed the brakes, and the DeSoto let out a loud, metallic screech, leaking a fresh drop of black motor oil right onto the spotless white gravel. We piled out of the car. 5 working-class guys from the flats, our suits a little rumpled, our shoes scuffed from the LA sidewalks. We walked up the marble steps to the front door like a foreclosure notice with legs. Joe rang the bell. A moment later, the massive oak door swung open, and a butler stepped into the frame. He wore a tuxedo that probably cost more than my apartment, and his nose was tilted so high in the air I was surprised he didn't trip. He took one look at our group, at Dogface's scarred jaw, Paulie's unbuttoned collar, and the heavy, deliberate way I kept my hand near my trenchcoat pocket, and his entire face went completely rigid with horror. He looked like he had just opened the door to a plague. "May I help you?" the butler asked, his accent sounding like he'd learned English from a textbook printed in London. "Yeah," I said, chewing on a dead matchstick. "We're here to see the boss. Tell him Morgan and Russo are here." The butler didn't move an inch. He looked at my scuffed wingtips with deep condescension. "The master is not receiving guests today, especially unannounced solicitors. I must ask you to leave the premises immediately before I summon the authorities." Dogface stepped forward, his massive, broad-shouldered frame completely blocking out the afternoon sun. He leaned in close to the butler, his voice sounding like 2 boulders grinding together. "Hey, pal," Dogface rumbled. "You want to summon somebody? Summon a mechanic. Because if you don't move your fancy ass out of the doorway, I'm going to break your front door off its hinges and use it as a toothpick." The butler's eyes went wide as saucers. He swallowed hard, his aristocratic posture evaporating into thin air. "Arthur, let them in," a sharp, aristocratic voice barked from the back of the grand hallway. The butler practically leaped out of the way, pressing himself against the wall as we filed past him. The man who had spoken was standing at the end of the hall, framed by a pair of massive glass doors that led out to the backyard. This was the tycoon. He was in his late 50s, wearing a silk smoking jacket and holding a crystal tumbler of scotch. He looked like the kind of man who owned 3 shipping lines and a seat on the stock exchange, but right now, his eyes were bloodshot and his hands were shaking just enough to make the ice rattle against the glass. All his millions hadn't bought him a single night of sleep. "Mr. Morgan? Mr. Russo?" he asked, his voice tight. "That's us," I said, taking off my fedora, but not stepping any further into his pristine hallway. "This is our crew. Follow me," he muttered, turning on his heel. "We'll talk outside. The house feels suffocating." He led us out through the glass doors to a backyard that looked more like a country club. In the center of it was a massive Olympic-sized swimming pool, the turquoise water sparkling perfectly in the California sun. There were white lounge chairs, imported palm trees, and a silver tea service sitting on a glass table. It was beautiful, expensive, and completely useless. The tycoon walked over to the edge of the pool, staring down into the water like he was looking for answers. "Don Pandolini said you were the best," the father said, his back to us. "He said you don't ask questions and you don't leave a paper trail." "Pandolini's right," Joe said, stepping up next to him, his notepad already out. "Let's start with the basics, Mr. Sterling. Tell us exactly what happened last night." The tycoon turned around, his face twisting into a mask of pure high society agony. "They took her right out of her bedroom. No one heard a thing. The security guards down at the gate were asleep or bribed. They left a note on her pillow. $500,000, or I get her back in a box." He looked at me, his eyes begging, but his voice still trying to sound like a man who gave orders. "I have the money, Mr. Morgan. I can pay it tenfold. But I want the men who did this. I want them destroyed." I looked at the massive pool, then back at his silk jacket. "We'll find them, Mr. Sterling," I said, a cold, cynical smile touching my face. "But out here in the dirt, all your money is just paper. If you want your girl back, you're going to have to let us play by our rules." The butler, Arthur, looked like he was about to faint as the 5 of us marched back into the marble hallway, our boots leaving dull gray smudges on the polished floor. "Show us the girls' room," I told Sterling, not giving him time to retreat into his grief. The tycoon didn't argue. He led us up a sweeping spiral staircase that felt wide enough to park a couple of delivery trucks on, eventually stopping in front of a heavy white door at the end of the eastern wing. He opened it, but he didn't step inside. He just stood by the frame, his shoulders slouched inside that expensive silk smoking jacket, looking anywhere but at the empty bed. "Go to work, boys," I muttered, tipping my fedora back. This was where the workplace comedy stopped and the infantry training took over. We didn't need fancy forensic labs or city slicker gadgets. Joe and I had learned how to read a room in the ruins of ruined European villages, where a single out-of-place wire or an unfamiliar boot print meant the difference between making it to breakfast or getting buried in a ditch. Joe went low, dropping to his knees to inspect the plush carpet near the window. "Window latch was forced from the outside, Jack. No scratches on the sill. Whoever did this had a proper jimmy and knew how to use it. They weren't amateurs." Paulie, surprisingly awake now that there was work to do, was checking the closet doors and the hinges, looking for scuff marks. Handsome was examining the vanity table, while Dogface just stood in the center of the room like a brick wall, keeping his eyes on the hallway to make sure the butler didn't get any bright ideas. I walked over to the nightstand. There was a small silver lamp, a copy of Peter Pan, and a pristine lace doily. I lifted the book, flipped through the pages, and found nothing. But as I set it down, my eyes caught a tiny piece of stiff, high-grade pasteboard shoved halfway under the base of the silver lamp. I pinched it out. It was a business card. It wasn't a standard corporate card, either. It was heavy cream-colored linen stock with embossed gold lettering that practically screamed old money, the Whispering Pines Country Club. members only. On the back, scribbled in faint, hasty pencil, was a single timestamp. Thursday, 9 a.m. I held it up, letting the gold leaf catch the afternoon sun. Joe, look at this. Joe walked over, squinting at the card in my hand. He let out a low, doubtful grunt. A country club card? In a 10-year-old girl's bedroom? It's a clue, Jack, but I don't know how good of one. Could have been dropped by a guest, a tutor, or one of Sterling's fancy friends last week. Maybe, I said, flipping the card over. But Thursday at 9 is tonight. The kidnappers gave him a week, but they're already moving. Pack it up. We're going for a drive. 30 minutes later, the DeSoto roared up the pristine, palm-lined driveway of the Whispering Pines Country Club. The place made Sterling's mansion look like a middle-class duplex. It was a sprawling, Spanish-style estate surrounded by acres of impossibly green golf courses, filled with men in white trousers and women holding thin glasses of champagne under oversized umbrellas. We piled out of the car, looking like a dark smudge on a clean sheet of paper. The moment we pushed through the frosted glass doors of the main lounge, the ambient chatter dropped like a stone. A guy in a pink polo shirt froze mid-swing with his highball glass. The club members looked at my rumpled trench coat, Joe's sharp but plain suit, and the sheer terrifying dimensions of dog face, and their faces twisted into pure high-hat disgust. A slick, athletic-looking guy with a tennis racket walked right up to me, blocking the path to the bar. He had a gold watch on his wrist and the kind of arrogant smirk that comes from never being hit in the mouth. "I think you fellas took a wrong turn," the tennis player said, his voice dripping with that ice-cold country club condescension. "The service entrance is around back. Deliveries aren't accepted through the lounge." "We're not delivering, pal," I said, keeping my hands in my pockets and chewing on my matchstick. "We're looking for whoever dropped this." I held up the cream-colored card. The guy didn't even look at it. He just sneered, stepping closer until he was practically breathing on my lapel. "Listen to me, you uncouth palooka. Get your grease-stained friends out of our club before I have the groundskeepers throw you into the lake. You don't belong here." He reached out, placing a soft, manicured hand on my chest to push me back. That was his second mistake. His first was waking up this morning. I didn't say a word. I just grabbed his gold watch strap, twisted his wrist until the bone popped, and drove my right fist straight into his pristine, high society nose. The crunch echoed beautifully across the lounge. Before he even hit the Persian rug, the whole room erupted. 3 of his wealthy buddies rushed us, thinking their Ivy League rowing experience meant they knew how to fight. It was a pathetic display. One guy tried to swing a leather golf club at Joe. Joe ducked beneath the arc, grabbed the man by his silk tie, and smashed his face into a mahogany card table, scattering poker chips everywhere. Another high-hatter tried to tackle Dogface. It was like a bicycle hitting a freight train. Dogface didn't even leave his feet. He just grabbed the guy by the belt and the collar, lifted him clean over his head, and threw him crashing through a massive plate glass window, landing him directly into a neatly trimmed rose bush outside. Handsome was laughing the entire time, ducking punches with Hollywood grace and breaking jaws with short, efficient left hooks. Even Paulie got in on the fun, smashing a crystal decanter of imported scotch over the head of a guy who tried to sneak up on him from behind the bar. It lasted maybe 2 minutes. By the time the dust settled, the exclusive lounge looked like a saloon after a cavalry riot. Elite blue bloods were groaning on the floor, holding broken noses and bleeding onto their white linen pants. I adjusted my fedora, picked up a stray, unbroken highball glass from a table, took a sip, and spat it onto the carpet. "Fucking piss water," I muttered. "Let's go." When we got back to the Bel-Air mansion, the news had already beaten us there. Sterling was pacing by his massive swimming pool, a telephone receiver dangling from its hook on the patio table. The tycoon looked at us as we filed out onto the terrace. His face was white with rage, but beneath the anger, he looked completely unimpressed with our methods. "Are you out of your minds?" Sterling shouted, his voice cracking through the quiet afternoon air. The president of the Whispering Pines board just called me. He said a group of armed thugs associated with me just hospitalized 4 of our city's biggest investors. You broke a $10,000 stained glass window. Joe didn't even look up from his notepad. The window was ugly anyway. This is a delicate, high-profile investigation, Sterling yelled, stepping right up to me, his silk robe billowing. I am paying you a fortune to be discreet, not to wage a one-man war against my peers. You're making a mockery of my family. I stood my ground, leaning in until my scuffed fedora was inches from his pristine forehead. The contempt inside me was burning hot, and I wasn't about to let this rich snob get the better of us just because he had a big checkbook. Listen to me, you gilded prick, I said, my voice dropping into a dangerous, icy whisper. Those rich snobs in that club know something, and they tried to put their hands on me because they thought my suit wasn't expensive enough. Out here in the dirt, your money doesn't buy you manners, and it damn sure doesn't buy you a pass to push my boys around. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the country club card, now slightly stained with the tennis player's blood, and flicked it onto the glass table next to his scotch. We do things our way, Mr. Sterling. If you want a group of polite, clean-cut boys who will say, yes, sir, while your daughter stays missing, go hire a law firm. But if you want the girl back, you shut your fucking mouth, stay by your pool, and let the adults handle the vermin. Remember, Sterling, money can't buy the dead. Sterling stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, completely paralyzed by a kind of defiance his millions had never encountered before. I turned my back on him and looked at the boys. Come on, Sarge is going to want a full report on how many of these silver spoon-fed assholes we just put in the hospital. Chapter 4. We didn't go back to the office to face Sarge just yet. Instead, we piled back into the DeSoto, the interior smelling like a mix of sweat, split knuckles, and the faint, expensive aroma of the country club scotch Paulie had smashed over that high-hatter's head. I parked the sedan right on the shoulder of a winding hill overlooked that gave us a perfect view of Sterling's sprawling estate down below. The engine let out a series of hot, metallic pings as it cooled down, sending up a thin wisp of gray smoke into the palm trees. All right, I said, throwing my arm over the back of the seat and turning to face the boys. The country club was a nice warm-up, but it didn't give us a name. We need to look at the mechanics of the snatched job itself. Joe, talk to me. Joe already had his notepad flipped open, his thumb smudging a carbon copy pencil sketch he'd made of the Eastern Wing. The estate has 24 rooms, Jack. 3 different wings, 2 guest houses, and a staff quarters over the garage. But the mutts didn't hesitate. They put their ladder against the exact window of the exact bedroom where a 10-year-old girl sleeps. They didn't guess, Handsome chimed in from the back seat, carefully adjusting his silk tie in the reflection of the window. You guess in a place that big, you end up walking into the master suite or a room full of Sterling security goons. They knew the layout. Which means one of 2 things, I said, lighting a cigarette and letting the smoke drift out into the afternoon heat. Either Sterling has made an enemy who spent months mapping out his life, or it's a pure crime of greed executed by an inside man. Someone who knows the schedule, the blind spots in the security gate, and the blueprints. Could be the butler, Paulie muttered, his voice raspy. Arthur looks like the type who'd sell out his own mother for a silver tea set. No, Joe countered, shaking his head. Arthur's a snob, but he's been with the family since Sterling was a kid in New York. He's too terrified of losing his pension to pull a stunt like this. I looked at his ledger while you guys were upstairs. He's clean. I leaned my head back against the leather seat, staring down at the white marble columns of the mansion. Then we start digging into the blueprint itself. Who built the place? Who worked on the renovations? A high-hatter like Sterling doesn't just hire a neighborhood carpenter. He hires contractors, designers, decorators, people who have access to the master keys and the layout of the Eastern Wing. Joe's eyes lit up. He flipped back a few pages in his notepad. When we were by the pool, Sterling mentioned a delicate matter of municipal leverage he handled last year. He put up a new wing on the house, the exact wing the girls' room is in. The contractor was a high-end firm out of Pasadena called Vanguard Construction. Vanguard, I muttered, the word tasting like corporate grease. And who runs Vanguard? A guy named Thomas Vance, Joe said. Big shot developer. Moves in the same circles as Sterling. Plays golf at the Whispering Pines Country Club. The puzzle pieces didn't just fall into place. They slammed together with the heavy thud of a cell door closing. The country club card, I said, a dark, cynical grin spreading across my face. The one with Thursday 9 o'clock p.m. scribbled on the back. Vance drops his card in the girls' room while he's scouting the window latch, or one of his hired mutts does it for him. But why would a wealthy developer snatch a kid? Handsome asked. Vance has his own mansion in the hills. Because guys like that are always one bad real estate gamble away from total ruin, I told him, blowing a ring of gray smoke toward the windshield. They wear the silk suits, they drive the fancy imported cars, but on paper, they're drowning in debt to the banks or the syndicate. They get desperate. They think because they're smart enough to build the house, they're smart enough to rob it. Dogface leaned forward from the middle of the back seat, his massive hands resting on the front headrests. So what's the play, Jack? We go pay this Vance guy a visit at the club tonight at 9? Not yet, I said, checking my wristwatch. It was barely 4 in the afternoon. We had 5 hours before the timestamp on that card meant anything. First, we go back to the office. Joe, I want you to run a wire to our contact down at the Hall of Records. Get the payroll sheets for Vanguard Construction for the last 6 months. Look for any discharged veterans, ex-cons, or local muscle Vance hired for private security during the mansion renovation. You think Vance didn't do the lifting himself? Paulie asked. A guy who wears a pink polo shirt and plays tennis doesn't climb ladders in the middle of the night, Paulie, I scoffed. He hires the kind of desperate palookas we usually deal with in the flats. If we find the mutts on his payroll, we find the girl. I threw the DeSoto into gear, the transmission groaning as I backed out onto the canyon road. Let's go face Sarge, I muttered, turning the wheel toward the city. If Joe's contact comes through, we're going to have a name and an address before the sun goes down. And by 9 o'clock tonight, Mr. Thomas Vance is going to find out exactly what happens when you bring working-class rules into a high-society game. When we pushed through the front door of the agency, the smell of industrial pine sol had been completely replaced by the heavy, comforting aroma of fresh beef stew and hot coffee. Rose had brought us some chow. I stopped dead in the doorway. Sarge wasn't at her typewriter. She was sitting at a cleared-off desk right next to Rose, who was holding a porcelain mug and laughing at something Sarge had just said. The two of them looked up as the 5 of us filed into the room, our rumpled wool suits looking even worse after a 2-minute war in a country club lounge. Rose took one look at my split lip, Joe's torn lapel, and the fresh dark smears on Dogface's knuckles, and her smile evaporated. She set her mug down with a sharp clack. I can't let you boys go anywhere, Rose said, crossing her arms and shaking her head. They started it, Rose, Paulie muttered defensively, shuffling past her toward the office couch like a reprimanded schoolboy. I'm sure they did, Sarge chimed in, her voice cool, administrative, and entirely unbothered by the sight of blood. She looked over the rest of us with a critical eye, stopping on Dogface. William, you have glass in your sleeve. Don't bleed on the rug. I just scrubbed it. Dogface blinked, looking down at his jacket, entirely defenseless against a woman with a clipboard voice. Yes, ma'am. Sorry, Sarge. I let out a dry grunt and leaned against the door frame. Great. It had been less than 4 hours, and the girls had already teamed up on us. We were outnumbered in our own bunker. Joe ignored the domestic tribunal, stepping up to Sarge's desk and tossing his notepad down. The timestamp on the card says 9 o'clock tonight. We think a high-end contractor named Thomas Vance is our man, or at least the guy holding the blueprints. He hangs out in the inner circle at Whispering Pines. Problem is, we just cleared out the front lounge with our fists. If we walk back through those glass doors looking like a tactical squad, they'll call the National Guard before we get 10 feet. Sarge leaned back, tapping a pencil against her chin. Then don't look like a tactical squad. If you need to get close to Vance, without his security blowing a whistle, you need to blend in with the country club. We all collectively groaned. Blend in? I scoffed. Sarge, look at us. Dogface's neck is wider than a fire hydrant. Paulie smells like a brewery, and my wingtips have seen 3 homicides and a flood. We don't blend in with people who wear pink shirts and spend their afternoons chasing a little white ball around the grass. The whole idea makes me sick. I think it's a wonderful idea, Rose said. A slow, devilish grin cracked across her face as she looked me up and down, her eyes sparkling with pure mischief. I'll bet you would look good in a suit, Jack. A real suit. One without cigarette burns. Don't start, Rose, I growled, feeling my collar suddenly get a lot tighter. She's right, Jack, Joe admitted reluctantly, rubbing the back of his neck. If we're going to corner Vance at 9 o'clock in the middle of a high society dinner, we can't look like a bunch of slobs. We have to look like we belong at the table. Otherwise, we're chasing him through the canyons instead of getting the girl's location quietly. I looked at Joe, then at Sarge, and finally at Rose, who was practically vibrating with amusement at my expense. The working-class pride inside me was screaming, but the clock was ticking, and a 10-year-old girl was sitting in the dark somewhere because some silver spoon bastard wanted a payday. Fine, I spat, pulling my fedora down over my eyes to hide the scowl. But if anyone asks me to play tennis, I'm breaking their racket over their fucking head and shoving the handle up their ass. We'll find a tailor who handles emergency cases, Joe said, already reaching for the telephone directory. Make sure they have something with extra room in the shoulders, William, Sarge called out as we headed back toward the door. We don't want you bursting a seam while you're being a gentleman. Are we going to let a couple of dames push us around? Dogface asks quietly, so Sarge does not hear. It's best to just agree and save yourself the headache. Paulie says, trust me. Chapter 5. Finding a tailor in Los Angeles who could fit 5 armed men for evening wear on 4 hours' notice was like trying to find a virgin in a sailor's bar. Joe managed to locate an old Italian craftsman named Solly down on 7th Street who owed Pandolini a favor from the old days. Solly took one look at Dogface's massive, scarred torso, let out a long, dramatic prayer in his native tongue, and went to work with a tape measure like a man constructing a canvas shroud for a monument. By 8:30, we were back in the DeSoto, and none of us were happy. I was suffocating in a black tuxedo that smelled like Solly's steam press and mothballs. The silk bow tie felt like a velvet noose tightening around my throat every time I turned my head. Joe looked like a slick corporate lawyer. Handsome looked like a movie star who'd lost his script. And Paulie kept clawing at his starched white collar like it was covered in ants. Dogface was the worst off. His black jacket was stretched so tight across his massive shoulders that the fabric groaned every time he took a deep breath. If I rip these pants, Dogface growled, his knuckles white on the wheel, I'm going to go back and break that old man's legs. Just keep your arms down, William, Joe muttered, checking the cylinder of his Smith & Wesson before tucking it back into the custom silk lining Solly had stitched into his waistband. You pop a button, you're going to take somebody's eye out. I reached into my breast pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold, heavy steel of my Colt 45. Solly had done a good job hiding the bulk, but a gun under silk still felt wrong. It felt top-heavy. It felt like putting a fresh coat of paint on a tank, which is what we all felt like. We pulled back through the wrought iron gates of the Whispering Pines Country Club at exactly 10 minutes to 9. The night air had cooled down, but the lounge inside was glowing with yellow light and the sound of a live jazz quartet playing something soft and pretentious. The parking lot was filled with shiny new Cadillacs, Lincolns, and imported sports cars. I parked the DeSoto right at the front entrance, right between 2 pristine town cars, and shut off the ignition. The engine gave one loud, defiant backfire that echoed across the manicured lawn. All right, I said, fixing my fedora in the rearview mirror. Handsome, you stay by the car. If anyone tries to leave early, you block the driveway. Paulie, Dogface, you flank the patio doors. Joe and I are going inside to have a chat with Mr. Thomas Vance. We got out of the car. In the dark, under the canopy lights, we almost looked like we belonged. The black wool hid the scuffs, and the starched shirts hid the grease. But as we walked up the marble steps, our strides were still the heavy, deliberate paces of infantrymen entering a combat zone. The hi-hats inside thought they were having a dinner party. They didn't know the front line had just moved into their dining room. The lobby had been cleaned up since our afternoon riot. The broken stained glass window was covered with a neat wooden partition, and a new manager was standing behind the desk, looking nervous. Joe and I walked past him without a word, heading straight into the main dining room. The air was thick with the scent of roasted duck, expensive perfume, and premium tobacco. And there, sitting at a round table near the center of the room, was Thomas Vance. He looked exactly like the kind of rich asshole I figured he would. Late 40s, silver hair, perfectly coiffed, wearing a midnight blue tuxedo with a silk pocket square. He was laughing, raising a glass of champagne to a couple of wealthy-looking older women sitting with him. He looked like a man who didn't have a care in the world. He looked like a man who hadn't spent the night watching a 10-year-old girl cry in the back of a van. The contempt inside me flared up, hot and oily. Joe and I didn't wait for an introduction. We walked right up to his table. I reached down, grabbed an empty chair from the adjacent layout, dragged it over, and dropped it right next to Vance. The heavy wooden legs scraped against the polished floor with a loud screech that made 3 different tables stop talking. Vance's laughter died instantly. He looked at me, his eyes tracking up from my black tie to the hard, unblinking stare under the brim of my hat. "Can I help you?" Vance asked, his voice stiffening as he tried to maintain his high society composure in front of his guests. "This is a private table." "It's about to get a lot more private, Tommy," I said, leaning in close enough that he could smell the diner coffee on my breath. I reached into my pocket and slid the gold-embossed linen card across the white tablecloth, stopping it right next to his champagne flute. The dried smear of tennis player blood on the corner was stark against the linen. "You dropped something in Sterling's house last night. Thursday, 9 o'clock. It's 9 o'clock, Tommy. Let's go for a walk." Vance's face went completely bloodless. The silver-haired charm vanished, replaced by the raw, twitching panic of a thief who just realized the floor had dropped out from beneath him. He looked at the card, then at Joe, who was standing right behind him, his hand resting casually inside his jacket pocket. I don't know what you're talking about," Vance stammered, his eyes darting toward the security guards near the door. "Your guards are outside, and my friend is currently showing them how he used to clear bunkers in Normandy," I whispered, my voice dropping into that dark, jagged register. "You can either stand up and walk out into the garden with us, like a gentleman, or I can paint this nice white tablecloth with your brains right in front of these lovely ladies. It's your choice, pal, but we're leaving in 5 seconds." Vance swallowed hard, the ice in his chest finally freezing him solid. He looked at the older women, gave them a horrific, trembling smile, and stood up. "Excuse me, ladies, a minor business matter." Joe kept a firm hand on the back of Vance's elbow as we guided him out through the side doors, leading him away from the lights of the patio and down into the dark, shadowed rows of the country club's private orange grove. The smell of rotting fruit and damp earth was thick in the air, cutting through the perfume. The moment we were out of sight of the windows, Joe shoved Vance hard against the rough bark of an orange tree. Vance stumbled, his midnight blue jacket catching on a branch, his silver hair falling into his eyes. "Talk," I said, stepping up to him. I didn't pull the gun yet. I didn't need to. He was nearly pissing himself already. "Where's Sterling's girl?" "I don't know," Vance cried, his voice cracking with high-class terror. "I swear to God, I don't know. I just gave them the blueprints. I owed money to the syndicate down in San Pedro. They said they'd clear my debt if I gave them the layout of the Eastern Wing. It's better to owe a small-time syndicate from San Pedro than to be on the bad side of Giuseppe Pandolini, I said, as the fear grew in his eyes. He was nearly dropping a steaming load in his pants by this point. Names, Tommy, Joe growled, stepping in close, his notepad forgotten. Give us the mutts who did the lifting. A guy named Miller, Vance choked out, tears finally streaming down his pristine cheeks. Red Miller! He runs a salvage yard down by the docks in San Pedro. He took the blueprints. He's the one who has her. Please, that's all I know. Don't kill me. I stared at him for 3 long seconds. The high society developer was reduced to a weeping, pathetic mess on the dirt, his expensive silk threads covered in mud and orange blossoms. This was the elite world Sterling wanted us to respect, a world built on luxury but entirely hollow when the wind blew hard. We're done with the fancy dress, Joe, I said, turning my back on Vance. I pulled off the silk bow tie and ripped it away from my collar, letting the buttons pop onto the grass. Tell the boys to get the tools out of the trunk. We're going to San Pedro. I looked back at Vance, my eyes cold as ice. You'd better be telling us the truth, Tommy, I muttered, because if you're not, it's going to get real bloody. The stench of salt water, diesel fuel, and rotting fish hit us before we even crossed the city limits into San Pedro. By the time I turned the DeSoto onto the gravel road leading to Miller's salvage yard, the fog was rolling in thick off the Pacific, turning the towering cranes of the docks into rusted ghosts against the night sky. We'd shed the fancy tuxedo jackets back in the canyon. Now we were just 5 men in dirt-streaked white shirts, suspenders, and shoulder holsters. The high society bullshit was behind us. We were back in the mud, where the ground was flat, and the rules were written in lead. I killed the headlights 100 yards out. The salvage yard was a fortress of twisted metal, acres of crushed sedans, rusted boilers, and stacks of bald tires, creating a jagged labyrinth in the dark. In the center of the yard sat a 2-story corrugated tin office, a single yellow bulb burning above the door. Check your irons, I muttered, killing the ignition. The click of 4 pistol cylinders rotating in the dark was the only reply. We moved out of the car in a synchronized skirmish line. Joe and I took the center lane. Dogface and Paulie skirted the perimeter through the mountains of scrap iron, and Handsome floated out to the left, his Colt held low and steady. The silence was wrong. A place like this should have had a barking guard dog or a lazy night watchman. Instead, the fog just drifted through the rusted wheel wells of dead cars. We reached the tin office without a sound. Joe kicked the door off its latch, and I rolled inside. My 5 swept across the room. Empty. There was a half-eaten plate of ham on the desk, a collection of empty beer bottles, and a small pink hair ribbon dropped right next to an unmade cot in the corner. I picked up the ribbon, my jaw tightening until it clicked. The cotton was still dry. She was here, Joe growled, touching the tin coffee pot on the hot plate. Burners still warm to the touch. They left in a hurry, Jack. Red Miller knew we were coming. A setup? Paulie started, but his voice was cut off by the sharp, metallic clack-clack of a Winchester lever action racking around outside. Down, I yelled. The corrugated tin walls of the office instantly turned into a colander as a hail of heavy-caliber gunfire tore through the room. Glass exploded from the windows, showering us in shards. Joe and I hit the floor, burying our faces in the grease-stained floorboards as the deafening roar of automatic weapons echoed across the salvage yard. Miller's mutts had us pinned in a tin box. From out in the yard, Dogface's heavy .45s started barking back, a steady, rhythmic thunder that was answered by a scream in the dark. "Flank 'em!" I shouted to Joe. We scrambled out of the shattered back window, dropping into the mud just as a man with a chopped-down shotgun stepped around a pile of iron beams. I didn't give him a chance to level the barrel. I drove 2 rounds into his chest, the impact lifting him off his feet and throwing him back into a stack of rusted oil drums with a deafening rattle. To my left, 3 more of Miller's gun handlers opened up from behind a crane structure. Muzzle flashes lit up the fog like strobe lights. A stray round caught Handsome right across the cheekbone, the bullet tearing a jagged, bloody line through the skin before shattering the headlight of a dead Packard behind him. Handsome stumbled back, his hand flying to his face. He pulled his fingers away, staring at the bright red smear in the moonlight. The easygoing Hollywood smirk vanished from his face. His eyes went completely wild, filled with a terrifying, vain fury. "My face!" Handsome screamed, his voice cracking through the gunfire. "The bastard shot me in the face!" He didn't take cover. He stood straight up in the open lane, his eyes burning with pure hatred. He leveled his piece with both hands and started marching forward into the muzzle flashes, unloading his cylinder with brutal, ice-cold precision. Bang, bang, bang. Every round found a home. The first mutt took a bullet between the eyes, dropping like a sack of cement. The second tried to turn and run, but Handsome put 2 rounds through his shoulder blades, dropping him into the dirt, then putting one in his head, point blank. The third man threw his hands up, his pistol clicking on an empty chamber, but Handsome didn't care about surrenders. He stepped right up to the man, pressed the hot barrel of his Colt under the guy's chin, and pulled the trigger. The silence returned to the salvage yard, heavy and thick, broken only by the hiss of a punctured radiator and Handsome's ragged, furious breathing as he wiped the blood off his cheek with his silk sleeve. "It's ruined," Handsome muttered, his voice trembling with rage as he looked at his reflection in a shattered car window. "The piece of shit ruined my looks." "You'll live, George," Joe said, his voice cold, as he walked past him to check the bodies. He turned back to me, shaking his head. "All 6 of them are dead, Jack. Red Miller isn't among them. He took the girl and hit the wind before we even parked." I stood in the center of the blood-splattered gravel, the empty .45 heavy in my hand. My mind wasn't on Miller. It wasn't on the docks. It was racing all the way back up into the pristine, manicured hills of Bel-Air. We hadn't told a soul we were coming here. We hadn't run the wires, and we hadn't left a paper trail. The only person outside of our bunker who knew the name Red Miller was the silver-haired developer we'd left shivering in the orange grove. The contempt inside me turned into a hard, unforgiving knot. "It was Vance," I said, my voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register that made even Dogface step back. The gilded prick played us. The second we turned our backs, he got on a telephone and tipped Miller off. Joe looked at me, his eyes narrowing as the realization hit him. He thought his wealth would buy him a way out of both sides of the fence. "He thought wrong," I muttered, shoving a fresh magazine into the handle of my Colt with a sharp, definitive slap. "Load up the car, boys. We're going back to the country club. And this time, nobody's wearing a tuxedo." Chapter 6. We didn't screech out of San Pedro right away. I pulled the DeSoto up next to a rusted shell of a gas station near the edge of the docks, the engine idling with a low, angry sputter. Dogface didn't say a word. He just pushed his massive frame out of the back seat, his white shirt stained with grease and mud, and walked over to a weathered wooden payphone booth by the roadside. He dropped a nickel into the slot, dialed a single number, and spoke into the receiver for less than 30 seconds. His face was entirely unreadable in the yellow glow of the booth. When he hung up, he walked back to the car and slid into the middle seat. "Everything set?" I asked, looking at him through the rearview mirror. "Yeah," Dogface rumbled, checking the action on his .45. "The word is passed." I threw the car into gear, and we headed back up into the hills. By the time we pulled back through the manicured gates of the Whispering Pines Country Club, the jazz quartet was still playing, but the crowd in the dining room had thinned out. I didn't park in the driveway this time. I rolled the DeSoto right up onto the pristine lawn, the heavy tires tearing deep, muddy ruts into the grass before coming to a halt near the side terrace. We got out, and the comedy was dead and buried. Handsome had a blood-soaked handkerchief pressed to his cheek, his eyes burning with a silent, lethal vanity. Polly, Joe, and Dogface moved like shadows, splitting up without a word to cover the main lobby, the kitchen doors, and the patio exits. There was no escape. The trap was sprung. I walked through the side glass doors alone. My shirt was torn at the shoulder, my knuckles were raw, and my shoulder holster was in plain view. I didn't care who looked. Thomas Vance was still at his central table, smoking a premium cigar and sipping a fresh glass of cognac. He had a smug, arrogant grin on his face, likely celebrating how easily he'd played the working-class palookas from the flats. He thought his wealth and his wits had bought him a clean slate, with Red Miller and a free pass from us. His grin died the exact second my shadow fell across his linen tablecloth. Vance looked up, his eyes widening in pure, paralyzed horror, as he saw the mud, the sweat, and the unmistakable stench of San Pedro gunpowder on my clothes. Before he could even open his mouth to scream for the club's security, I reached across the table, grabbed him by his silk blue tie, and hauled him clean out of his chair. "We're leaving, Tommy," I whispered, slamming him face first onto the table, scattering silver platters and crystal glasses with a deafening crash. I dragged him backward through the dining room by his collar, his expensive leather shoes scraping helplessly against the floorboards. The remaining club members gasped and shrank back into their booths, entirely too terrified of the look in my eyes to play the hero. Joe held the door open as I hauled Vance out into the night and threw him into the trunk of the DeSoto like a sack of scrap iron. We didn't take him back to the flats. We drove straight to Sterling's mansion. When the butler, Arthur, opened the grand oak door this time, he didn't look condescending. He looked like he had already seen a ghost. The lights in the grand hallway were dim, and the house was dead silent. We shoved Vance through the entryway. He stumbled onto his knees, his midnight blue tuxedo ruined, his silver hair matted with sweat. He looked up, expecting to beg Sterling for mercy. Instead, sitting in a high-backed velvet armchair right in the center of the marble foyer, was Don Giuseppe Pandolini. The old man looked perfectly composed. He wore his heavy wool overcoat, his gloved hands resting peacefully on the silver head of his walking stick. Sterling was standing 5 feet behind him, completely pale, looking less like a powerful tycoon and more like an assistant in his own home. The reason for Dogface's phone call was sitting right in front of us. "Bring him closer," Pandolini said, his raspy voice cutting through the marble hall like a razor through silk. Joe and Dogface grabbed Vance by the shoulders, hauling him to his feet and shoving him down right in front of the Don's chair. "Don Pandolini," Vance whimpered, his voice shaking so hard his teeth clicked. "I swear, I didn't have a choice. I owed money. I didn't know they'd take the girl." Pandolini didn't interrupt. He just listened, his face a mask of calm, patriarchal sorrow, like a grandfather listening to a disappointing child. He slowly pulled off his leather gloves, one finger at a time, and placed them neatly in his pocket. "Thomas," the Don said softly, leaning forward, "you built this house. You know the foundation. You know what happens when a structure is built on rotten wood." Yes, Don Pandolini," Vance stammered, thinking the soft tone meant there was room to negotiate. Then, the storm broke. It happened so fast it didn't seem possible for a man of his age. Pandolini's hand blurred. The heavy silver head of his walking stick swung through the air with a vicious, sickening crack, striking Vance squarely across the jaw. Vance let out a choked shriek as the impact shattered his teeth and sent him crashing sideways onto the white marble floor. But Pandolini wasn't done. The old man stood up, his face suddenly twisting into something ancient, cold, and utterly demonic. The gentle grandfather was gone. In his place stood the man who had carved his way through the New York factions with a bloody straight razor 30 years ago. Pandolini stepped forward, driving the iron tip of his cane directly into Vance's broken mouth, pinning his head to the polished floor. "You betrayed my name," Pandolini hissed, his voice dropping into a terrifying guttural growl that made even Joe and me take a subconscious step back. We'd seen men die in the mud of Europe, but the raw, concentrated malice vibrating off the old man was something entirely different. It was the absolute authority of the graveyard. You gave a child to vermin. You used a telephone to protect them. Look at me, Thomas. Vance could only let out a wet, gurgling sob, his eyes wide with a level of primal terror that money could never cure. He was staring directly into the face of his executioner. "You're going to give Jack the exact address where Red Miller took that girl," Pandolini whispered, leaning his weight onto the cane until Vance's face turned purple. "And if you lie to him, Thomas, I will personally ensure that your death takes 3 days, and your family will watch every single fucking second of it because I will cut off their fucking eyelids and make them watch. Speak." The tycoon, Sterling, actually turned his back, unable to look at the raw underworld reality unfolding on his expensive rug. Vance didn't hesitate. Through the blood and the broken teeth, the words poured out of him like water from a burst pipe. "The old ice house. Down by the rail lines, 3rd and Alameda. They took her there. I swear to God, 3rd and Alameda." Pandolini stared down at him for a long, agonizing second, making sure the truth had been thoroughly squeezed out. Then he smoothly pulled his cane back, wiped the silver tip with a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket, and sat back down in the velvet chair. The demonic fury vanished instantly. His face returned to that calm, peaceful, patriarchal composure. He looked up at me, tipping his hat slightly. "3rd and Alameda, Jack," the Don said, his voice back to its quiet, raspy murmur. "Exterminate the vermin. Leave the contractor to me." I shoved my hands into my pockets, my heart hammering against my ribs from the display we'd just witnessed. I looked at the boys, then nodded toward the door. "Let's go," I said, my voice hard. "We have an ice house to burn." The rain started just as we hit the industrial tracks of 3rd and Alameda. It wasn't a clean rain. It was a heavy, oily LA downpour that turned the soot-stained gravel of the rail yards into black grease. The old ice house loomed out of the fog like a concrete fortress. It was a massive, windowless block from the turn of the century, its walls thick enough to keep the cold in, or to drown out the sound of a struggle. A lone delivery truck was parked near the loading dock, its engine ticking over idly. "Joe, Paulie, cover the back platform," I said, my voice barely louder than the rain hitting the DeSoto's roof. "Dogface, you're with me on the main door. Handsome, keep your eyes on the road. If anybody leaks out, fucking drop 'em." Handsome didn't look at his pocket mirror this time. He just gave a tight, lethal nod, the white bandage across his gunshot cheek already pink with fresh blood. Dogface and I didn't waste time picking locks. We stepped up to the heavy wooden sliding door of the loading dock, and Dogface threw his entire weight against it. The rusted tracks gave way with a screech of tearing iron, and we broke through into the cavernous, freezing interior. The air inside was freezing, our breath pluming into white clouds under the dim, yellow bulbs hanging from the rafters. "Who's there?" a voice barked it from the darkness behind a row of rusted meat hooks. A muzzle flash split the blackness, a round thudding into the wooden door frame inches from my head. I dropped to one knee, my Colt 45 already leveled. I fired 3 times into the shadow behind the flash. A heavy grunt followed, and the man clutched his throat, stumbling out into the dim light before collapsing into a pool of stagnant, icy water. From the back of the warehouse, another gun started barking. Miller. He was firing blindly as he retreated toward a set of reinforced wooden locker rooms in the back. "I've got him, Jack," Dogface yelled, charging forward like a tank, his heavy service pistol laying down a wall of suppressive fire that chewed the wooden partitions to splinters. I didn't follow the gunfire. My eyes were on that back locker room door. Through the thunder of the shots and the groaning of the old building, I heard a sound that didn't belong in a war zone. A tiny, muffled sob. I broke into a dead sprint, slipping past the meat hooks as Joe and Polly breached the back doors, trapping Miller in a crossfire. The final exchange of gunfire was short, brutal, and definitive. I heard Red Miller's shotgun clatter across the concrete floor, followed by the heavy, unmistakable sound of Dogface putting an end to the conversation. Then, total silence fell over the ice house, save for the steady, rhythmic dripping of melting frost. I kicked open the door to the small office at the back of the locker room. It was a filthy, windowless space, smelling of stale tobacco and wet coal. And there, sitting on an overturned wooden crate in the corner, was Sterling's daughter. She was wearing a torn white nightgown, her bare feet covered in soot. Her hands were tied behind her back with coarse hemp rope, and a thick piece of gray tape was slapped across her mouth. Her eyes were wide with a terrifying, wild panic, staring at my blood-smeared shirt and the heavy black gun in my hand like I was just the next monster in line. I stopped. The hard-boiled, cynical detective from the flats vanished. The guy who had just dragged a millionaire across a country club lounge didn't exist anymore. I slowly dropped my Colt into its shoulder holster, making sure the metal didn't clink. I took off my scuffed fedora and set it gently on a dusty table, then dropped down onto both knees, bringing myself down to her level so I didn't look so big. "Hey there," I said. I forced my voice to go low, smooth, and quiet, the tone I used to use when I was trying to calm down wounded kids in the barracks before the medics arrived. "It's all right. The bad guys are gone." She shrank back against the concrete wall, a muffled whimpering coming from behind the tape, her small shoulders shaking violently in the freezing air. "My name's Jack," I said, moving my hands forward very slowly, palms up, showing her they were empty. "I'm a friend of your dad's. Don Pandolini sent me to bring you home." Hearing the name seemed to stall the panic in her eyes just enough. I reached out, my rough, scarred fingers gently catching the edge of the tape on her cheek. "This is gonna sting a little bit, okay? Just a tiny bit. Hold real still for me." With one quick, careful motion, I peeled the tape away. She let out a sharp gasp, her chest heaving, but she didn't scream. She just stared at me, the tears finally spilling over her dirt-streaked cheeks. They said they were going to put me in the river," she whispered, her voice cracking with the cold. "Nobody's putting you anywhere," I told her, shifting around to her back. I pulled a small pocket knife from my trousers and cleanly sliced through the hemp ropes around her wrists. The moment her hands were free, she didn't run. She just collapsed forward, her small arms wrapping tightly around my neck, burying her face into my grease-stained shoulder. She was shivering so hard her teeth were rattling. Behind me, the heavy boots of Dogface and Joe approached the doorway, the scent of fresh cordite clinging to their clothes. I didn't want her seeing what was lying out on that warehouse floor. She didn't need to see the blood on the gravel or the empty expressions of the men who had taken her. "Keep 'em back, Joe," I called out over my shoulder, my voice sharp but quiet. "Get the DeSoto warmed up. Bring the heater up to full." "Payload's clear, Jack," Joe's voice came back, unusually soft. "We'll wait by the car." I unbuttoned my heavy wool trench coat, slid it off my shoulders, and wrapped it entirely around her, swaddling her in the oversized fabric until she looked like a bundle of dark wool. I lifted her up into my arms, her small weight lifting easily against my chest. "Keep your eyes shut tight, kiddo," I whispered into her hair, placing my large hand over the side of her face to block her view of the corridor. "Don't open them until we're back in the car. Deal?" "Deal," she whimpered, clutching the lapel of my shirt. I marched out of the dark, freezing ruins of the ice house, past the dead mutts and the shattered crates, carrying the only thing in Los Angeles that was actually worth $1 million. Chapter 7. The ride back to the Bel-Air mansion was completely silent, save for the hum of the DeSoto's heater running at full blast. The little girl had stopped crying, curled up tightly inside my oversized wool trench coat, her eyes fixed on the dashboard lights, as if they were the only safe thing left in the world. When I pulled up to the white marble steps, the front doors were already wide open. Arthur, the butler, wasn't there to greet us. It was just Sterling, his face a pale, hollow mask of desperation, standing on the threshold under the canopy lights. I cut the engine, opened the door, and lifted the girl out of the front seat, keeping her swaddled so the cold rain wouldn't touch her. The moment Sterling saw her, the tycoon let out a choked, ragged sob and rushed down the steps, his hands shaking as he reached for his daughter. "Oh, God, Emily." "Emily!" he wept, pulling her into his arms. But as Sterling turned to carry her back into the grand hallway, the girl's eyes adjusted to the dim light of the foyer. She looked past her father's shoulder, her small frame suddenly freezing solid. Then a piercing, wild shriek of pure terror ripped out of her throat. She was staring directly at Thomas Vance. The developer was still kneeling on the marble floor where Pandolini had left him, his blue tuxedo jacket torn, his face a swollen, bloody mess of shattered teeth. He looked pathetic, but the second the girl saw him, she started clawing at her father's robe, trying to push herself away. "He's the one!" she screamed, her tiny voice echoing marble walls. "He's the one who was in my room! He's the one who said they were going to put me in the river!" The air in the hallway turned to solid ice. Vance wasn't just a desperate debtor who had traded a blueprint to clear his ledger. He wasn't just a coward caught in the middle. He was the one who had climbed the ladder. He was the one who had stood over a 10-year-old girl's bed and threatened her life. He was the mastermind. Something inside my chest snapped. A hot, blinding wave of red flooded my vision. My hand moved strictly on instinct, my fingers wrapping around the checkered grip of the Colt 45 in my shoulder holster. I wanted to clear the leather, step across the foyer, and empty the entire magazine into his chest until there was nothing left of his silver-haired high society face. Joe saw the look in my eye and instantly grabbed my forearm, his grip like a steel vise. "Jack, no," he muttered through his teeth. "The kid. Not in front of the kid." He was right. The deafening roar of a 45 inside that marble hallway would have shattered whatever sanity the little girl had left. I forced my hand away from the gun, my chest heaving, my knuckles turning white as I stared at Vance, who was weeping silently on the floor, knowing his protective cover was completely gone. Pandolini slowly stood up from his velvet armchair. He didn't look angry. He looked like an undertaker preparing a shroud. He walked over to Sterling, his raspy voice exceptionally gentle. "Take your daughter upstairs, Mr. Sterling. The work is finished here." Sterling didn't ask questions. He held the screaming girl tight and hurried up the grand spiral staircase, disappearing into the upper wings of the mansion. Once the doors upstairs clicked shut, Pandolini turned his ancient dark eyes toward me. He stepped close, his heavy wool overcoat smelling faintly of old tobacco, and leaned in until his lips were inches from my ear. "Route 27, the Don whispered, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that didn't carry past my shoulder. "The old canyon stone quarry. 3 miles past the county line. Meet me there in 20 minutes. He pulled back, his face returning to that calm, patriarchal composure. He looked past me at Joe, Dogface, Polly, and Handsome. "Go home, boys," Pandolini said aloud, tipping his hat slightly toward the door. "You have done a grand service tonight. I'm going to bring Thomas back to his house so he can settle his affairs and collect the money from Mr. Sterling." "Yes, Don," Joe said, giving a respectful nod. We filed out of the mansion, our boots loud on the marble, but we didn't go back to the flats. We didn't go back to Rose's hot coffee or Sarge's clean office rug. 20 minutes later, the DeSoto's tires were crunching over the wet gravel of a deserted, overgrown turnout on Route 27. The rain was still coming down in steady, rhythmic sheets, obscuring the jagged silhouette of the abandoned stone quarry down in the ravine. A black luxury town car was already parked there, its headlights cut, its exhaust pipe sending a lazy trail of white steam into the dark canyon air. I stopped the sedan right behind it. Two of Pandolini's heavy-set San Pedro connections got out of the front seats of the town car. They walked to the back, opened the back door, and dragged Thomas Vance out into the mud by his armpits. They flung him onto the gravel right between the two cars, his expensive blue trousers instantly soaking through with black dirt. Don Pandolini stepped out of the back seat, holding his silver-headed walking stick. He walked over to the edge of the headlight's glow, looking down at the ruined developer like he was looking at a dead dog in the road. "Get him up," I muttered, stepping out of the DeSoto. Dogface and Paulie flanked Vance, grabbing him by his crumpled lapels and hauling him onto his knees. Vance couldn't even speak anymore. His jaw was unhinged, his eyes rolling back in his head with a level of primal terror that transcended words. He knew where he was. He knew what the gravel meant. Pandolini looked at me across the rain-slicked space. He didn't say a word about the money or the country club or the blueprints. He reached into his heavy overcoat pocket and pulled out a small, worn object. It was a classic, heavy-handled straight razor with a yellowed ivory scale. The steel was stained and dark with age, the personal blade he had carried through the New York streets since he was a teenage soldier in the old country factions. He flipped the razor open with a practiced, single-handed click of his thumb, the lethal edge gleaming under the DeSoto's parking lights. He held the handle out to me. "Exterminate the vermin, Jack," Pandolini said softly, his raspy voice entirely steady against the sound of the rain. I looked at the old man, then looked down at the silver-haired mastermind who had threatened a 10-year-old girl with a dark river just to save his own wealthy skin. The working-class pride, the infantry training, the raw, hard-boiled justice of the flats, it all came down to this exact patch of mud on Route 27. I didn't say a word. I just gave a single definitive nod. I stepped forward, my left hand reaching down to grab Vance by his silver hair, pulling his head back until his throat was taut against the night air. He let out one final wet gurgle of protest. With a smooth practice motion of my right hand, I brought the ancient ivory razor across his neck. The cut was clean, deep, and instantaneous. A heavy dark crimson spray hit the wet gravel, muffled immediately by the downpour. Vance's body went completely limp, his forehead hitting the mud with a dull thud as Paulie and Dogface let go of his jacket. I wiped the dark steel of the razor on Vance's silk blue lapel, freeing it of the high society blood, then stepped back and handed the blade back to the Don. Pandolini accepted the razor, checked the edge, and flipped it shut with a sharp, metallic snap. He slid it back into his overcoat pocket, tipped his hat to the team, and turned back toward his town car without looking at the ground. "Get in the car, boys," I said, my voice dropping into that cold, empty register as the rain washed the red off my knuckles. "The job is done." The drive back from Route 27 was a quiet blur of windshield wipers and wet pavement. Nobody spoke. By the time I pulled the DeSoto into the gravel alley behind the agency, the dashboard clock was pushing 3:45 in the morning. We didn't go inside right away. I killed the engine, and we just sat there in the dark, listening to the rain hit the roof. Dogface pushed his massive frame out of the back seat. He didn't head for the office door. Instead, he walked over to Pandolini's luxury town car, which was parked undercover in the garage bay. The Don's lower-level guys had left it there for Dogface to clean before morning. He grabbed a bucket of water and a stiff brush to start scrubbing the dark, drying stains of Thomas Vance's blood out of the running boards. Suddenly, the heavy rhythm of his brush stopped. "Jack!" Dogface rumbled, his voice cutting through the damp night air. "Get over here." Joe and I walked over. Dogface was reaching deep into the narrow crevice between the leather front cushions of the Don's car, his massive fingers pulling out a crumpled, sweat-stained slip of parchment paper. It must have slipped out of Vance's pocket when the bastard was dragged out of the vehicle. I took the paper, smoothing it out against the wet hood of the DeSoto, under the single bulb of the garage. It was a transport routing slip signed by Vance himself, Friday, 200 hours, SP Dock 14 Pierhead. Cargo 12 units. Joe stared at the clinical, neat numbers. 12 units of what? He's a contractor, not a freight hauler. And what's he doing shipping out of San Pedro at 2 in the morning? I don't know, I muttered, shoving the slip deep into my trousers pocket. But the office is dead, and my brain feels like wet cement. Let's go see Rose. The neon sign for the diner was a blurry pink halo through the fog. At 4 in the morning, the place was empty except for a sleepy truck driver at the counter and the steady hum of the refrigerator. Rose was behind the counter, a fresh pot of high-octane coffee in her hand. The moment the bell above the door jingled, and she saw the 5 of us walk in, sweaty, mud-streaked, with Handsome holding a bloody rag to his cheek. She didn't blink. She just set the pot down and pointed toward the big corner booth in the back, away from the windows. "Sit," Rose murmured, her voice carrying that steady, midnight weight. We slid into the vinyl booth. Within 3 minutes, she had 5 heavy ceramic mugs of black coffee on the table, followed by a mountain of fried eggs, thick-cut ham, and hot buttered toast. She didn't ask about Bel-Air, and she didn't ask about the blood. She just stood at the end of the table with a bottle of iodine and some clean gauze, gently cleaning the jagged bullet graze on Handsome's cheek while he grumbled under his breath. "You're going to have a scar, Handsome," Rose said softly, taping the gauze down with practiced efficiency. "Consider it character." "It ruins the symmetry, Rose," Handsome muttered, though he was already inhaling his eggs. I sat back, letting the heat of the mug warm my raw knuckles. Sitting here in the warmth of the diner, smelling the grease and the coffee, the cold horror of the ice house finally began to recede. We ate in absolute silence, 5 men recovering from a night raid. By the time we finished, the sky outside the diner windows was turning a pale, dirty gray. It was just past 8 in the morning when we walked back into the agency. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets steaming in the morning sun. Sarge was already there. She looked crisp, clean, and completely removed from the nightmare we'd spent the night fighting. She was sitting at her desk under the window, methodically sorting through the heavy stack of municipal record books and property ledgers Joe's contact had dropped off from the Hall of Records, logging our expenses to officially close out the Sterling file. She looked up as we filed in, her pencil hovering over her ledger. She took one look at our wrinkled clothes and Handsome's fresh bandage, letting out a sharp, administrative sigh. "I assume the Sterling girl is safe since none of you are in handcuffs," Sarge stated, her voice tight. "She's home, Sarge," Joe said, leaning against the doorframe. "Good. Then help me clear this desk," Sarge muttered, tapping her pencil against a sheet of blue carbon paper with an annoyed frown. "Joe, your contact down at the records office is an idiot. I asked for Vanguard's residential construction permits for the Bel-Air district so I could audit their corporate tax flow, but half of this stack is filled with old public works logs from the flats. Orphanages, migrant housing blocks, the San Pedro transit hubs, it's a complete mess." I stopped in the middle of the room, my hand instinctively touching the crumpled slip of paper in my pocket. "What kind of public works, Sarge?" "Renovations," Sarge said, flipping through the sheets with a clerical scowl, completely blind to the pattern. "But the billing numbers don't match the labor hours. Look at this. Vanguard logged 3 weeks of overtime labor at the San Pedro orphanage last spring. But according to the city plumbing ledger, they only laid 12 feet of pipe. Huge crews, 0 actual structural changes. It makes no clerical sense. Why waste manpower sitting in the basement of an orphanage?" Joe's eyes snapped toward mine, the exhaustion instantly vanishing from his face. I walked over to her desk, pulled Vance's crumpled shipping manifest out of my pocket, and dropped it flat onto the blue carbon sheet she was complaining about. "Read that date, Sarge," I whispered, my voice dropping into that dark, jagged register. Sarge looked at the slip, then back at her ledger, her administrative composure suddenly freezing solid. She wasn't a detective, she was just a damn good bookkeeper. But when you put a shipping manifest for 12 domestic units right next to a list of unverified Vanguard crews working inside local orphanages and tenement blocks, you didn't need a badge to see the abomination. "Oh, Jesus, Jack," Sarge whispered, her face going completely bloodless as she stared at the paperwork. "They weren't building anything. They were mapping the layouts," Joe growled, his fists clenching until his knuckles popped. "Vanguard is a meat market. They harvest the kids from the poor neighborhoods because those families don't have the power to make the LAPD look for them. Emily Sterling was just a test run to see if they could upscale the business to the hills." The office went entirely still. The $750,000 from Sterling's vault was sitting in our safe, but the weight of that cash didn't mean a damn thing anymore. I looked at the clock on the wall. 8:15 a.m., Thursday. The manifest was for Friday at 0200 hours. That gave us exactly 18 hours before a freighter pulled away from Dock 14 with 12 kids from our streets locked in the dark. I walked over to the gun cabinet, the brass key heavy in my hand. "Sarge," I said quietly, locking eyes with her. "Lock the front door. Close the blinds. We're going to war." Chapter 8. The brass key turned in the lock of the gun cabinet with a heavy, definitive click. I swung the glass doors open, the scent of gun oil and cold steel drifting out into the room. "Sarge," I said, not looking back as I pulled a trench gun from the rack, "I need you to take an active hand in this. The records from the orphanages and the tenement blocks are only half the pipeline. A racket this size needs a legal front to move the paper. Check the local adoption agencies. Look for any crossover with Vanguard's board of directors or any private notary seals that pop up on both sets of books." Sarge didn't hesitate. The horror of what she'd accidentally uncovered earlier was still sitting behind her eyes, but it had hardened into a cold, sharp efficiency. "Give me 2 hours, Jack. If there's a paper trail bridging Vanguard to a cradle, I'll pull it." She grabbed her coat, her purse, and her notepad, marching out the front door before the clock even struck 9. By noon, she was back. She didn't look tired. She looked dangerous. She dropped a single index card onto the center of my desk. "The Cradle and Hearth Adoption Society on Wilshire," Sarge stated, her voice tight and even. "A private outfit. 3 of Vanguard's chief investors sit on the trust board. But more importantly, I found the grease man, a city clerk named Marcus Vance, Thomas Vance's second cousin. He coordinates the unlisted domestic placements through the society's back office." "The peddler," Joe muttered, leaning over the chair. "He's at a lounge on 6th Street every Thursday at noon," Sarge added, adjusting her collar. "Takes his lunch alone, in the back booth. Pays in cash." I looked at Dogface and Polly, who were already checking the actions on their pieces. "Let's go buy Marcus a drink." We didn't use the DeSoto this time. We used one of Pandolini's unmarked delivery vans from the San Pedro fleet. Marcus Vance never saw the punch coming. Dogface cornered him in the alley behind the 6th Street lounge just as he was stepping out the back door. One heavy gloved fist to the liver dropped the clerk into the grease bins, and before he could even draw breath to scream, Paulie had a burlap sack over his head and a heavy canvas strap around his torso. We threw him into the back of the van and drove straight to our stomping grounds. We didn't take him to our office. We took him back to the Pandolini mansion. Down we went, deep into the belly of the estate, into the exact same basement where Murphy had faced his final judgment. It was a concrete bunker that smelled of stale lime, damp earth, and 30 years of unrecorded history. There were no windows, no light from the sun, just a single bare 40-watt bulb dangling from a frayed cord over a heavy oak chair bolted to the floorboards. Dogface ripped the burlap sack off Marcus Vance's head. The clerk was a soft, pale man in a tailored gray suit that was now ruined with alley grease. His glasses were gone, his thin hair was matted with sweat, and his eyes rolled around the damp concrete room in pure, paralyzed terror. I didn't say a word. I just stood back in the shadows, my hands shoved deep into my trenchcoat pockets, letting the gravity of the situation do the heavy lifting. Joe stepped into the light under the bulb, his black notebook open in his hand, a pencil balanced between his fingers like a scalpel. "Marcus," Joe said, his voice terrifyingly polite, "we know about the Cradle and Hearth Society. We know about the 12 units listed for Dock 14 tomorrow morning. What we want from you is the mechanics. How does the handoff work, and who takes delivery on the water?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus shrieked, his voice bouncing off the concrete walls in a pathetic, high-pitched echo. "I'm a city employee. You can't do this. My cousin Thomas will—" "Your cousin Thomas is at the bottom of a quarry with his fucking neck cut, Marcus," I said from the darkness. My voice was quiet, flat, and entirely empty of emotion. The clerk froze, the blood instantly draining from his face until he looked like a corpse. "Dogface," I muttered, nodding toward the chair. "Ask him nicely." Dogface stepped forward, his massive scarred hands looking like meat hooks under the yellow bulb. He didn't use a pipe or a blackjack. He just leaned his massive weight over Marcus, grabbed the clerk's right hand, and cleanly snapped his index finger backward until the bone gave way with a sharp, sickening pop. Marcus let out a choked, deafening shriek, his body convulsing against the leather straps of the chair, his face turning purple as the agony hit his nervous system. "That's for the San Pedro orphanage," Dogface rumbled, his face inches from the clerk's sweating nose. "We have 9 more fingers, Marcus. The clock is ticking." "Stop! Stop! Please, God, stop!" Marcus wept, the spit flying from his broken lips as he cradled his hand against his chest. "I'll talk. I'll tell you whatever you want." Joe didn't look up from his notebook. He just clicked his pencil. "The handoff, Marcus. Speak." The freighter is called the Caspian City," Marcus sobbed, the words pouring out of him in a frantic, terrifying rush. "It flies a Panamanian flag. Vanguard secures the Pier Guard rotation through the San Pedro precinct. The precinct bosses clear Dock 14 from midnight until dawn. The manifest is logged under industrial machinery parts to bypass customs." "And the kids?" I asked, stepping closer to the light. They bring them in through the Vanguard transit trucks at 1 a.m, Marcus whispered, his head hanging low, tears dripping onto his grease-stained tie. "They load them into the lower coal bunker beneath the main deck. The captain handles the overseas buyers once they clear international waters. I just sign the release forms. That's all I do. I swear to God, I just sign the papers." Joe finished writing, shutting his notebook with a sharp, final snap. He looked over at me, his eyes hard as flint. "We have the name of the ship, Jack. The Caspian City. Dock 14, 1 o'clock for the trucks." I looked down at the weeping clerk, his soft, high society life completely shattered on the concrete floor of Pandolini's basement. The protection instinct inside me wasn't a warm feeling anymore. It was an execution order. "Leave him strapped to the chair, Dogface," I said, turning my back on the light and heading for the stairs. "Let him think about the kids he has sold into God knows what until tomorrow morning." We climbed out of the dark, leaving Marcus Vance to his tears in the cellar grease. The rain was starting up again as we stepped out of the mansion's rear entrance, the sky above the LA basin turning the color of bruised iron. We had the target, we had the time, and the war was coming. By 2 p.m, the office of the Morgan and Russo Detective Agency felt less like a workspace and more like a command bunker. The heavy green curtains were pulled tight against the blazing California sun, leaving the room illuminated by the sharp, localized glow of Sarge's desk lamp and the amber tip of my Camel. Joe wasn't pacing. He was sitting on the edge of the desk, his black notebook open, staring at the phone receiver like it was a live grenade. "We can't just roll in there with the guns and start pulling triggers, Jack," Joe said, his voice flat and steady. "Say we clear the deck. Say we drop every Vanguard gunner on Dock 14 and open that coal bunker. What then? We've got 12 terrified kids from the tenements, a Panamanian freighter, and a harbor full of international jurisdiction. 5 guys in a DeSoto can't handle a logistics operation that size. We need the law, the real law. I took a long drag of my cigarette, watching the smoke drift past the glass cabinet where the trench guns were waiting. The San Pedro precinct is bought and paid for, Joe. Captain Miller's men are the ones clearing the pier. Miller isn't the whole department, Joe muttered. He reached out and grabbed the heavy black phone receiver. Dialing a number he still knew by heart, he didn't call the local precinct. He bypassed the captains, the desk sergeants, and the dicks on the beat. He dialed the direct private line of Chief William Parker, the big man at the top of the LAPD hierarchy, our former boss. The line clicked twice before a gravelly, authoritative voice barked through the wire. "Parker." "Chief, it's Russo," Joe said, his voice dropping into that formal, disciplined register he used back when he wore the blue uniform. "I'm sitting with Jack. We've got the Vanguard ledger from the Sterling case, and we just pulled a manifest out of Thomas Vance's second cousin. It isn't an extortion racket, Chief. It's an abduction ring. They've been harvesting the orphanages and the tenement blocks for years." The line went dead silent for 5 agonizing seconds. Through the receiver, we could hear the faint sound of Parker shifting papers on his desk. "You're out of uniform, Joe," Parker said, his voice cool and measured. "Vanguard is one of the biggest municipal contractors in the state. Thomas Vance has lunch with the mayor twice a month. If you're throwing dirt that high, you better have more than a notebook and a grudge." "We have the ship, Chief," Joe snapped, his knuckles turning white around the plastic receiver. "The Caspian City, Panamanian flag. It's sitting at Dock 14 right now. At 1 o'clock tomorrow morning, Vanguard transit trucks are delivering 12 children from the neighborhood to be loaded into the lower coal bunker. Captain Miller's boys are scheduled to look the other way." Another long silence. Then a heavy, tired sigh from the other end of the line. "If I send a tactical division down to the waterfront, on the word of 2 private investigators who just quit the force, and we find crates of industrial pipe instead of children, the fallout will bury my office, the political structure in the city." I didn't let Joe finish the conversation. I stepped forward, reached out, and snatched the receiver cleanly out of his hand, bringing it to my mouth. "Listen to me, Parker. You son of a bitch," I hissed into the mouthpiece, the raw anger finally breaking through my cynical shell. "This isn't about political structures or city hall luncheons. We're talking about children. Kids who don't have anyone looking out for them. Now you can mobilize a fleet of squad cars and a dozen transport vans to secure that pier and bring those children home properly. Or Joe and I take this Vanguard manifest and the Hall of Records logs straight to the fucking Los Angeles Examiner before the sun goes down." I leaned in closer, my jaw tight. "By tomorrow morning, the rags will have a front-page layout detailing exactly how the LAPD turned a blind eye while a high society meat market hollowed out the local orphanages. It will be the biggest scandal this city has seen since the 20s, and your badge will be the first one in the gutter. Do you understand me, you bloated old bastard?" On the other end of the wire, we could hear Parker's breathing go heavy and deliberate. He knew us. He knew we weren't bluffing. We had the data, and we had the stones to burn the city down to get those kids back. "Dock 14, Parker finally whispered, his voice dark and tight with an intense, calculated fury. 1 o'clock. My tactical units will block off the harbor access points at precisely 0115 after the transit trucks are inside the perimeter. If those trucks are empty, Morgan, I will personally see to it that you and Russo share a cell in San Quentin for the rest of your natural lives." "They won't be empty," I said flatly. "Just make sure your boys bring blankets." I slammed the receiver back onto the cradle, the plastic crack echoing through the quiet office. Across the room, Sarge let out a breath she'd been holding for 3 minutes, her shoulders dropping slightly. At the base of my leather chair, Hammett opened his green eyes, let out a low mew, and curled his black tail tighter around his paws, completely unbothered by the declaration of war. Joe looked at me, a grim, dangerous smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He picked up his black pencil and crossed a line through our preparation checklist. Well, Joe muttered, reaching into his pocket for a smoke, we've got our force, Jack. This turned into something way bigger than us. Yeah, I said, lifting the heavy gun from the table and sliding a shell into the chamber with a loud, metallic clack. Now we just have to make sure the trap snaps shut. Chapter 9. The sea fog rolled off the San Pedro Channel in thick, freezing blankets, wrapping the rusted iron cranes and corrugated warehouses of Dock 14 in a ghostly shroud. It smelled of brine, diesel fuel, and dead fish. We left the DeSoto 2 blocks back and crept into the shadows of a timber stack. Right behind us, moving with the heavy, disciplined stealth of an infantry platoon, came Chief Parker and 30 of his top-tier tactical boys, all of them carrying heavy-caliber Winchesters and riot guns. Because the brass was on the scene, we had to play this hand strictly by the book. No back-alley snatches, no preemptive trigger pulls. We waited, cold mud soaking through our boot leather, and observed the pier. Through the shifting fog, the massive silhouette of the Caspian city loomed against the black water. Lanterns hung from the gangway, illuminating the dock workers pushing heavy hand carts. But it wasn't just dock workers. My jaw tightened as I spotted the glint of silver badges and uniform buttons through the mist. Captain Miller's dirty precinct cops were everywhere, pacing the perimeter, acting as guards for the very abomination they were paid to lock away. Chief Parker didn't hesitate. He stepped out of the shadow of a steel shipping crate, his heavy overcoat thrown back, his service revolver drawn and leveled. LAPD, nobody move! Parker's voice boomed across the water like a cannon shot. Hands where I can see them! For a fraction of a second, the world froze. A few of the Vanguard guards and 2 of the uniformed harbor cops slowly raised their palms into the air, their faces pale with shock. But all it ever takes is one palooka to ruin the peace. Down by the gangplank, a silver-haired Vanguard enforcer panicked, clearing his leather holster and snapping off a wild shot toward the police line. The bullet sparked off a steel girder, and then the night completely exploded. It was a massive, deafening firefight. The enclosed dock instantly turned into an echo chamber of industrial slaughter. The Vanguard syndicate muscle and Miller's renegade cops ducked behind wooden pallets and iron freight containers, unleashing a jagged wall of lead. The deafening roar of a Tommy gun chewed into the timber stack right above our heads, raining sharp splinters over my fedora. "Return fire!" Parker roared, and the tactical division let loose. "Kill the bastards!" I yelled. The bloodshed was immediate and unmerciful. A Vanguard gunner rose to aim a sawed-off shotgun, but 3 Winchester rounds caught him square in the chest, ripping through his wool coat and throwing a bright spray of dark crimson against the white-painted hull of the freighter. He collapsed backward, his boots kicking uselessly against the gravel as his life pooled into the mud. Beside me, a young tactical officer screamed as a stray .38 slug tore cleanly through his neck. He dropped his riot gun, his fingers clutching at his throat as bright arterial blood geysered through his hands, soaking his blue uniform lapels in seconds. The air grew thick with the choking stench of cordite, burning grease, and copper. Dogface and Paulie pinned down a cluster of Miller's dirty uniform cops behind a loading crane. Dogface leaned out, his heavy trench gun barking twice. The double-aught buckshot caught a rogue officer full in the face, shattering his jaw and sending his uniform cap spinning into the oily harbor water as his body flipped over a handcart. From the other flank, a tactical cop's skull was split open by a ricochet, dropping him instantly onto the wet planks without a sound. It was an absolute butchery of men who used to wear the same badge, tearing each other to pieces in the freezing fog. "Joe, now!" I yelled over the deafening symphony of shattering glass and screaming lead. Joe didn't need to be told twice. Using the chaos and the dense smoke as a screen, he and I broke from the timber stack, our boots flying across the blood-slicked planks as we made a mad dash for the freighter's midship loading port. We had to get to the kids before a desperate crewman sunk the ship or used them as shields. We breached the hull, our guns leveled, slipping through a steel hatch into the damp, echoing dark of the lower decks. The smell inside hit me like a physical blow. Stale bilge water, suffocating coal dust, and the sharp, sour stench of human sweat, unwashed bodies, and terror. It was the smell of cattle cars, the smell of a slaughterhouse. We threw ourselves down a narrow steel companionway, the noise of the firefight outside instantly becoming a dull, rhythmic thudding against the hull. At the bottom of the ladder, we found the coal bunker. I choked back a breath. Huddled together on a single, grease-stained tarp in the freezing dark were the 12 kids from our neighborhood. Their small faces were completely blackened by coal dust, leaving only white tracks where their tears had dried. They were shivering so violently their teeth clicked in the dark, clutching one another like a single terrified animal. One little boy, no older than 7, stared at my trench gun and hid his face in the little girl's tattered sweater. "Joe," I rasped, my voice cracking, the protection instinct inside me swelling until it felt like it would split my ribs open. "Get him up! Get him out of the dark!" Joe dropped to one knee, his rugged face softening into something incredibly gentle. He laid his heavy .45 on a crate and reached out his massive hands. "Hey, kids," he whispered, his voice low and steady, the tone he used back when he had to tell families the worst news. "We're friends. We're taking you home. Let's go." One by one, Joe started hauling them up the iron ladder, wrapping them in blankets the tactical boys had dropped near the hatch. They didn't cry. They were too far gone for tears, just moving like hollow little ghosts. "Keep moving them, Joe," I grunted, my knuckles turning white around the grip of my gun. "I'm clearing the rest of this belly." I pushed past the bunker, my boots echoing off the iron floorboards as I kicked open a heavy, insulated, watertight bulkhead further into the ship's keel. I expected supplies or contraband or crates of liquor. Instead, the beam of my flashlight caught rows of heavy, rusted iron bars. My heart stopped. The entire lower cargo hold had been converted into a menagerie. Cages, dozens of them, stacked too high against the sweating steel walls of the ship. And inside them were children. A sea of small, hollow eyes caught the reflection of my light. There were black children from the migrant camps, white kids from the local orphanages, Mexican children from the tenements near the rail lines, and faces I couldn't even place. All stripped of their names, packed 3 and 4 to a cage so small they couldn't even stand up. The floor of the cages was covered in soiled straw. Some of them were reaching their tiny, trembling hands through the iron bars, letting out weak, rattling whimpers that sounded like dying birds. Then the flashlight beam drifted to the far corner, beneath a heavy canvas tarp, and the world completely fell away. It was a pile. Just a discarded pile of small, lifeless legs, stiff fingers, and matted hair. The ones who had succumbed to the freezing damp, the starvation, or the lung rot before the ship could even lift its anchor. Stolen from their beds, died in the dark, and thrown into a corner like spoiled meat. A hot, blinding wave of pure, unadulterated hatred flooded my throat, tasting like copper and bile. The fury was so loud, it drowned out the ringing in my ears. "Joe, get down here!" I screamed, a raw, ragged roar that ripped my throat raw. "Bring the cutters! Bring everything!" Joe came sliding down the companionway, and the second his light hit the cages, he let out a choked, horrific gasp. His black notebook slipped from his hand, hitting the wet iron floor forgotten. "Oh, Christ! Oh, sweet Christ, Jack!" "Smash the locks!" I shouted, my voice shaking with a murderous desperation. We went feral. Joe used the heavy bolt cutters, snapping the padlocks with brute, frantic force, the metallic snaps echoing through the hold like gunshots. I used the butt of my trench gun, swinging it with everything I had left, shattering the brass hasps until my hands were bruised and bleeding. We ripped the iron doors open. For a second, the children didn't move. They just stared at us in paralyzed terror. "It's okay," I croaked, reaching into a cage and gently pulling out a tiny, shivering girl whose ribs were showing through her thin smock. "Go, run for the deck. The light's up there. Go!" Then the dam broke. The children flooded out of the iron enclosures. It was a desperate, chaotic exodus of saved souls, their bare feet slapping against the cold steel floor as they ran blindly toward the fresh air, the harbor light, and the dying gunfire of the pier. They poured past us like a living river, fleeing the tomb they'd been buried in. I couldn't look at the corner again. I turned my back on the dark, my eyes burning, and charged back up to the main deck, hunting for the man who had allowed this horror to happen. Up on the bow, the sea fog had thinned out under the glare of the police searchlights. Chief Parker had Captain Miller cornered against the iron railing. Miller's uniform cap was gone, his expensive blue jacket was torn, and his hands were trembling as he backed up until the metal bit into his spine. Parker stood 5 feet away, his heavy service revolver leveled directly between the corrupt captain's eyes. Miller was hyperventilating, his face slick with sweat and sea spray, trying frantically to plead with the man who used to sign his promotions. "You wouldn't shoot me, William?" Miller wheezed, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of fraternity. "Think about the department. Think about the rags. I'm a fellow officer." "You're a dirty officer, Miller," Parker said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that carried the weight of a stone monument. "And you're a monster." I ran over, my boots skidding on the blood-slicked deck planks, and slammed the hot, smoking barrel of my trench gun directly against Miller's temple, my finger tightening on the trigger. I wanted to see his brains on the iron. I wanted to erase him for what was in that hold. "Morgan, don't do it," Parker said quietly, his eyes never leaving Miller's face. "Not even you would shoot a cop in cold blood." I stared into Miller's yellow, terrified eyes. The infantryman in me, the guy who still remembered the rules of the line, took a slow, shuddering breath. The kids were out. The ship was ours. Slowly, deliberately, I lowered the barrel, stepping back an inch. Chief Parker's eyes went completely dark. A cold, old-world look of final judgment settling into his face. "But I would," Parker whispered. Bang! The muzzle flash lit up the fog, and a smoking, bloody hole opened up perfectly in the center of Miller's forehead. The corrupt captain didn't even scream. His eyes rolled back, his knees buckled, and his body flipped cleanly over the iron railing, hitting the dark harbor water with a heavy, final splash that was swallowed by the tide. I stood there, the sudden silence of the pier ringing in my ears. Honestly, I was impressed. I looked over at the chief, adjusted the brim of my scuffed fedora, and let a slow, approving smile touch the corner of my mouth. The old man still had balls. Parker checked the cylinder of his revolver, blew the smoke from the barrel, and slid it back into his leather holster. He looked at me through the mist, his face returning to that calm, administrative mask. "I might lose my badge over this one, Morgan," Parker said, a grim, joking smirk finally tugging at his lips. "If I do, are you and Russo hiring?" "You'll have to talk to Sarge about that, Chief," I replied, pulling a fresh Camel from my pocket and striking a match with a bloody thumb. "I'm putting her on hiring duty. It was bad enough trying to hire a secretary." The remaining gunfire on the pier had died down to a few scattered pops. Dogface, Handsome, Polly, and Joe walked up the gangplank, their trenches stained with grease and the dark blood of Vanguard's muscle. Around the dock, the surviving tactical cops, were looking at our enforcers with a profound, newfound respect. They'd seen how the boys handled themselves when the leads started flying. One young tactical officer, his uniform shirt torn down the front from a brawl, stopped next to Dogface, looking at his massive build and the calm, rhythmic way he was reloading his piece. "Hey, pal," the officer asked, genuinely impressed. "You ever thought about joining the force? We could use a man like you." Dogface stopped, looked the kid sideways with his scarred, unglamorous glare, and let out a dark grunt. "I'd rather eat that revolver," Dogface rumbled, walking right past him without another word. By dawn, the Vanguard ring was completely destroyed. The harbor was flooded with ambulances, transport vans, and social workers, but every single child we pulled from that hold was safe. The sheer scale of the rescue made the LAPD look like gods in the eyes of the public. A masterstroke of policing that would keep Chief Parker in his office for as long as he wanted it. The next morning, the Los Angeles Examiner hit the pavement with a roar. The gold leaf lettering on the door of the Boulevard office caught the morning sun perfectly, and right beneath it, the front page headlines carried our names in bold black ink. "Private Agency Smashes Waterfront Abduction Ring. Above the Law. Morgan and Russo Save Children, Chapter 10. By the time we pulled the DeSoto back into our side of town, the long LA night was finally losing its grip. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, bleeding a pale, watery orange through the morning smog. Barely a word was spoken for the entire ride from San Pedro. The adrenaline had completely burned out, leaving us sore, bloody, and bruised, our joints stiffening up as the heater rattled under the dashboard. I glanced over at the boys in the rearview mirror. Handsome was gingerly touching his bandaged cheek, and Dogface looked like he'd been dragged through a coal chute. "How does a cup of coffee sound?" I asked, my voice a gravelly scrape. "I could go for a cup," Handsome replied, his usual vanity completely drowned out by exhaustion. We pulled up to the curb and walked into the diner, our boots heavy on the linoleum as we slowly piled into the big corner booth. "Looks like you've been through it, all of you," Rose said. She didn't wait for us to ask. She just moved down the table, setting down 5 heavy ceramic mugs and filling them right to the top with steaming black coffee. She didn't need to ask what happened. She had already seen the morning edition of the Examiner. The front page article was already neatly cut out, taped squarely above the order window next to the daily specials menu. The coffee was boiling hot, and as the caffeine started hitting our bloodstreams, the cold shock of the night finally began to recede. We were still sore, but our moods started to lighten. The heavy silence broke, and the old back alley conversation livened up. The jokes and the casual ribbing started coming across the table, the boys testing each other's bruises just to prove we were all still vertical. Joe leaned back against the vinyl booth, nursing his mug, his sharp eyes cutting over to me. "So, Jack, when are you and Rose actually getting married?" I let out a dry breath, looking down at the dark reflection in my coffee. "We haven't set a date. Hell, we haven't really talked about it. We've been a little busy lately, if you haven't noticed. Look, we have the sterling money now. We could have a grand, high society wedding if we wanted to. But, truthfully, I'd be just as happy to walk down to the courthouse and get it over with." Rose must have caught the conversation from behind the counter. She walked over, wiping her hands on her white apron, her pinned-back rolls completely level. "I don't have anything going on tomorrow," she said flatly. I stopped my mug halfway to my mouth, staring up at her. "Are you serious?" "Dear, we can do the fancy wedding later on down the road," Rose said, a small, genuine warmth breaking through her tough exterior. "The courthouse suits me just fine. Just you, me, and our odd little family." I couldn't help but let a little smile touch my face. I took a sip of the coffee, looking up at her, and realized Don Pandolini had been absolutely correct. She is an amazing woman, one worth dying for, worth killing for. But standing here in the morning light of the diner, I knew the real truth. She was the one worth living for. I turned back to the booth, raising my mug slightly toward the crew. "Well, boys, looks like we're getting married." The table erupted into a chorus of groans and grins, the mood continuing to improve until we felt like our old selves again. With the tension gone, the hunger finally returned to us with a vengeance, and we ordered a massive spread. I had my usual scrambled eggs, thick-cut ham, and hot buttered toast. After filling our bellies and paying the ticket, we stretched our sore muscles and made the short drive over to the office. Sarge was already there, the green curtains drawn back to let the morning sun hit the floorboards, methodically setting up the ledger for the day. Hammett was sitting on her desk, getting head scratches. "Little traitor," I said to him, and put a fresh can of food out for him. Paulie didn't even care about the neat layout. He just limped across the room and flopped his massive frame down onto the leather couch, still covered in the black grime and dried blood of the San Pedro docks. Sarge didn't even look up from her paperwork. "Boots off the couch!" she scolded, her voice sharp as a schoolmarm's ruler. "Sorry, Sarge," Paulie muttered, quickly dropping his heels back to the floorboards with a sheepish grin. Joe and I leaned against the doorframe, and we gave her the full, unfiltered rundown of the night's events. The shootout, the cages, Chief Parker's final judgment on Miller, and the headlines now drying on the street corners. When we finished, I walked over to her desk, leaning my hands on the dark wood, looking her dead in the eyes. "This isn't a normal secretary job, Sarge," I said, my voice dropping into a serious register. "Are you still sure you want to work with a bunch of crazy people like us?" Sarge dipped her steel-nibbed pen into the inkwell and looked me dead in the eye without a single hint of fear. "Don't think you can scare me off that easily, Mr. Morgan," she replied, immediately pulling a fresh carbon sheet toward her ledger, a smile coming to her face. I looked over at Joe, then back at Sarge, a quiet, proud smile on my face as I reached into my pocket for a Camel. What can I say? I have damn good taste in women. The monkey suits were still stiff from the dry cleaner, smelling of heavy starch and cedar blocks. They were the same formal tuxedos we'd picked up for that undercover stunt at the Whispering Pines Country Club. Expensive wool, silk lapels, and collars designed to choke a man slowly. After the absolute brawl we'd gotten into at the country club took its toll, the suits had been a total wreck. But we'd taken them back to Solly's tailor shop on the boulevard to get the seams repaired and the blood scrubbed out. If we had the damn things sitting in the back of the closet, we might as well get some good use out of them. But that didn't stop the bitching from the ranks. We were huddled in the back office of Solly's shop, getting the final linings pinned up. "I look like a high society jackass in a bad moving picture," Dogface rumbled, trying to force his thick, scarred neck into a starched wing collar. He looked sideways at the mirror, his broken nose and cauliflower ear contrasting horribly with the polished silk bow tie. If any of the boys could see me in this layout, I'd never hear the end of it. "Stop squirming," Paulie grunted, leaning heavily on his cane while Solly pinned up his trousers. Paulie's black tuxedo pants had a jagged rip near the knee. "At least your pants don't have a ventilation shaft." Handsome was the only one not complaining. He stood in front of the three-way glass, smoothing the lapels of his midnight blue jacket with absolute reverence. "You boys have no appreciation for the finer cuts. A man doesn't choose the tuxedo chooses the man." "This fucking one is choosing to cut off my circulation," Joe muttered, tossing a stray collar stud onto the table. He looked over at me, his rugged face remarkably clean-shaven for once. "You sure about this, Jack? We could still just walk into City Hall in our trenches and save $30 on the alterations." I fastened the silver cufflinks, checking my reflection. The knuckles on my right hand were still bruised purple from smashing the iron padlocks in the freighter's keel, but the black sleeve hid the worst of it. "Rose wants the courthouse, but she doesn't want us looking like we just rolled out of a San Pedro grease bin," I said. I reached into my vest pocket, pulled out the gold band, and looked at Joe. "Besides, I need someone to hold the hardware without dropping it down a storm drain. You in, partner?" Joe stopped messing with his cuffs. He looked at the ring in my palm, then up at my eyes, his sharp gaze softening into that old, disciplined register of mutual survival. "I'm in, Jack," Joe said, his voice quiet and steady. "Best man, just don't expect me to give a speech." The Los Angeles County Courthouse didn't care about our silk lapels. It still smelled of industrial floor wax, old paper, and stale tobacco smoke. A massive gray concrete fortress where the city handled its misery. We stood in the third-floor corridor under the harsh glare of the civic lights, our leather shoes echoing off the worn marble floorboards. Sarge stood by the frosted glass door, acting as the maid of honor with the exact same military efficiency she used on our agency ledger. She wore a sharp, tailored dark dress, her notebook replaced by a small bouquet of simple street-corner carnations she'd secured for Rose. Then the heavy elevator doors at the end of the hall slid open, and the crowd parted. Don Pandolini stepped out into the marble corridor. He was the definition of a dapper gentleman, wearing a bespoke charcoal three-piece suit, a gold watch chain looping across his vest, and a polished fedora tilted at a precise old-world angle. He leaned lightly on his silver-headed cane. "Don Pandolini," I said, stepping forward. "I didn't think you did civic buildings." "For family, Jack, I make exceptions," Pandolini said, his voice a low, gravelly purr that carried the absolute weight of the underworld. He looked over the row of tuxedos, a slow, approving nod favoring the boys. "You clean up remarkably well for a bunch of back-alley headbreakers. The stock looks good." Before Dogface could grumble, the office door clicked open and Rose walked out. The country club suits instantly felt worth every dime. She wasn't wearing white silk or lace, just a simple, tailored navy blue dress that hit her right at the knees, a small pillbox hat pinned to her red hair with a thin piece of netting that just brushed her eyelashes. She didn't need a high society budget. Her natural, sharp beauty completely took the breath out of the room. "You're late, Morgan," Rose said, her voice steady, though her fingers tightened slightly around the carnation stems. "Hanson was fussing over the color of his pocket square," I replied. "Step inside," the clerk barked from the doorway, checking his clipboard. "The justice has a probate hearing at 10. The wedding went off without a single hitch. Justice of the peace. Arthur Vance, no relation to the Vanguard crowd, thank God, drilled through the standard civic bullshit from his little black leather book. He didn't ask about the bruises on my hands, and he didn't ask why the Don of the city's largest syndicate was standing in the back of his office checking a gold pocket watch. "Jack Wayne Morgan, do you take this woman?" "I do," I said. "Rosemary Gallagher, do you take this man?" "I do." Joe handed over the ring with a flawless, practiced hand. The gold slid over her knuckle perfectly. "By the authority vested in me, husband and wife. Sign the book. Next." The whole thing took exactly 3 minutes. No tears, no sappy speeches. Just a done deal, stamped and logged by the state of California. The second the heavy oak doors of the courthouse shut behind us, the dignity evaporated. The afternoon sun was already baking the concrete steps of Broadway, and the heat inside those heavy wool tuxedos was turning into an absolute furnace. We didn't wait for a celebration. We made a mad, frantic rush straight back to our side of town, piling into the DeSoto like a bunch of bank robbers trying to beat a siren. We burst into the back room of the agency office, and the jackets came flying off before the door was even fully latched. "Get me out of this fucking straitjacket!" Dogface growled, ripping the silk bow tie from his neck with enough force to pop the button. He threw the starched collar onto Jack's desk and immediately reached for his faded denim shirt and the heavy leather holster hanging from the coat rack. "Careful with the tailoring!" Handsome yelled, though he was already kicking off his patent leather shoes and sliding back into his broken-in loafers. "Lolly worked miracles getting those country club stains out." Paulie unbuckled his formal vest with a heavy sigh of relief, slinging it over the back of the couch before Sarge could even open her mouth to scold him. He pulled his old, oil-stained trench coat back over his shoulders. his cane clicking against the floorboards with its usual familiar rhythm. Joe was already back in his gray trousers and suspenders, sliding his black notebook back into his breast pocket where it belonged. He looked over at me, his collar open, looking like a regular flatfoot again. "Well, the law says it's official, Jack. How do you feel?" I pulled my old charcoal suit jacket back on, slid my fingers into the familiar, deep pockets of my scuffed trench coat, and adjusted the brim of my fedora. I reached into my pocket, struck a match against the radiator, and lit a fresh Camel. "I feel like myself again," I said, the smoke drifting past the glass door, where the gold lettering caught the afternoon sun. I looked over at Rose, who was still in her navy dress, looking completely unbothered by the transition. Hammett, who had been watching all the commotion, just gave a yawn and went back to his napping place. Duke soon joined in, curling up beside him. Oh, the life of a cat. Unbothered by it all. Must be nice. We didn't end the night at the counter of the diner. For once, the flat top remained cold. We took a bit of the sterling money and piled the whole crew into a large leather ring booth at a quiet wood-paneled steakhouse down on 4th Street. It wasn't the sort of high society joint where they looked at your fingernails before they gave you a menu, but it had heavy white tablecloths, a thick layer of sawdust on the floorboards, and the smell of charred hickory hanging thick in the air. We sat around a massive round table, the plates piled high with thick cuts of steak, loaded baked potatoes, and baskets of hot bread. "How would you like your steak cooked, sir?" the waiter asked, pencil hovering over his pad. "Medium rare," I said, "and keep the coffee coming." The tension of the last 48 hours didn't just fade. It evaporated into a chorus of clinking glasses and heavy laughter. For the first time since we kicked down the doors at Dock 14, nobody was looking over their shoulder. Handsome was halfway through a bottle of Chianti, loudly fabricating a story about how he single-handedly leveled 3 high society assholes in the country club, while Paulie casually threw a piece of bread at his head to shut him up. Oh sat back with a rare, genuine smile, throwing in his own dry barbs. We were loud, we were rough around the edges, and we were entirely out of place among the regular patrons. One big, beautiful, odd family. When the plates were finally cleared, we moved the party down the block to a basement lounge called the Blue Lantern. The place wasn't fancy, it didn't need to be. It had a low ceiling, neon beer signs casting a red glow over the booths, a 5-piece jazz band sweating on a small stage, and a bar that didn't skimp on the pour. The whiskey flowed like water. Pandolini was the first one out of his seat. For a man who ruled the city's rackets with an iron fist, he was a surprisingly light-footed bastard on the floor. He caught Sarge by the hand, tilted his fedora, and swept her into a classic, old-world box step. Sarge didn't even blink. She kept her posture perfect, her laugh ringing out over the brassy blare of the saxophone as the old Don spun her under the low lights. When Pandolini finally bowed out, catching his breath with a satisfied chuckle, Joe took his turn. He didn't have the Don's smooth polish, but he had a regular detective's rhythmic cadence, catching Sarge around the waist and twirling her across the hardwood floor until she was nearly breathless. Even Paulie had managed to surprise us. He had brought Veronica along for the evening. After everything that he had said about his married life, I had been keeping my guard up. But watching her laugh at one of Paulie's terrible jokes while she helped him balance against his cane, she didn't seem too bad to me. She fit right into the noise. I was sitting back in the booth, my arms slung over the vinyl behind Rose's shoulders, nursing a glass of bourbon, when a massive shadow fell over the table. Dogface stood there, his giant frame completely blocking out the neon light from the bar. He was back in his faded denim shirt, his heavy leather shoulder holster hidden just beneath his open jacket. He rubbed the back of his neck, his scarred, broken nose twitching with an uncharacteristic touch of nerves as he looked down at us. "Hey, Jack," he rumbled, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly register. He cut his sharp eyes over to Rose, then back to me. "I was, wondering if it would be okay if I danced with the bride, just one number. I looked up at the big gorilla, a sly, knowing smile pulling at the corner of my mouth. I took a slow sip of my bourbon, letting the heat settle in my chest before I answered. Only if you bring her back in one piece, pal, I said, giving him a sharp wink. She needs to save her energy for the wedding night. Rose let out a sharp, breathless laugh, planting a firm elbow right into my ribs before sliding out of the booth. She caught Dogface by his massive, calloused hand and led him straight toward the center of the floor, leaving me at the table with the smoke, the liquor, and the best view in the house.